Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never been good at talking about this. Even typing it now, my hands are shaking a bit, but after seeing that documentary about strange encounters in rural America last night, I figured maybe it's time I finally put this down somewhere. I've only told a handful of people over the years. Most just laughed or gave me that look, you know the one. But what happened to me back in '76 was real, and I've carried it with me for over 45 years. I was 12 years old, living in Medina County, Ohio. My parents had just built our new house that spring, not far from my grandparents' place. There was this little wooden footbridge connecting our properties that I used to cross almost daily. I had a pretty awesome childhood setup, if I'm being honest. Acres to explore, creeks to splash in, trees to climb. Our land stretched pretty far, all the way to Interstate 76 on one side and Greenwich Road on the other, with Route 57 just down the street. That September was particularly beautiful. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air had that special smell. Not quite summer anymore, but not fully fall either. I remember my mum had made pancakes that morning, and I'd wolfed them down, eager to get outside while the weather was still nice. School had started back, but it was a Saturday, which meant freedom. My parents weren't super strict, but they did have one major rule: never go beyond my great-grandmother's tree line. This was a row of old maple trees that had been planted decades before I was born, marking the edge of what my parents considered safe territory. The forbidden zone was this thick patch of woods to the right of our house. I knew there was another family's property behind those woods, but I'd never been back there. Looking back, I think it was the perfect day for breaking rules. The sun was warm on my face, there was a light breeze, and the whole world seemed to be beckoning. I'd already explored all my usual spots. The creek bed where I collected interesting rocks, the old fallen oak that made a perfect balance beam, the little clearing where wild blackberries grew in summer. I was bored, and the forbidden forest was right there. I remember standing at the tree line, looking into those woods, and feeling this mixture of excitement and anxiety. I had this childish thought that if I just went a little ways in, it wouldn't really count as breaking the rule. Just a peek, that's all. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves that crunched under my sneakers. Beams of sunlight cut through the canopy, creating these beautiful dappled patterns. I remember feeling so grown up and adventurous, like some explorer in a book. I followed what looked like a faint path, probably made by deer or other wildlife. The further I went, the more my courage grew. I wasn't scared at all, just curious. I must have gone about halfway between my great-grandmother's tree line and whatever lay beyond when I saw it. At first, I thought someone had abandoned an old white shag rug, or maybe a large dog was rooting around in the underbrush. It was maybe 30 yards ahead of me, partially obscured by a cluster of saplings, and it appeared to be in a squatting position, something white and hairy. My first thought was honestly that it might be our neighbor's big white sheepdog that sometimes got loose. I remember calling out, not words exactly, just that kind of questioning sound you make when you're trying to get an animal's attention. That's when it stood up. It's hard to describe the feeling that went through me. It was like my whole body turned to ice while my brain short-circuited. This thing unfolded itself from the ground and just kept rising, 7 feet tall at minimum, maybe taller. And as it rose, time seemed to stretch out impossibly. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, and everything else went silent. The birds, the rustling leaves, everything. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably just a couple of seconds, we just stared at each other. It hadn't fully turned toward me yet, but I could see enough. Its legs were covered in thick white hair. Not fur exactly, but hair. Its arms hung down way too far, almost to its knees, and its shoulders were incredibly broad. The entire body was covered in that same white hair, which wasn't pristine white, but more of an off-white, almost yellowish in places. I couldn't see its face clearly. I thank God for that every day. It was starting to turn toward me, and something in my brain finally screamed, "Run!" And I did. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. Branches whipped at my face and arms, but I didn't feel them. I tripped twice on exposed roots, but scrambled back up instantly. I didn't look back, not once. Something primal told me that looking back would be the worst mistake I could make. I burst out of the tree line and kept running all the way to our house. I remember slamming the door behind me and locking it, then checking all the other doors and windows. My mom was vacuuming upstairs and hadn't heard me come in. I didn't tell her what happened. I couldn't form the words. And besides, I'd been somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside my window made me freeze. The next day, I stayed inside, claiming I didn't feel well. For weeks afterward, I wouldn't go near that tree line, let alone cross it. My parents noticed the change, but attributed it to me growing up, or maybe having a falling out with neighborhood friends. I never told anyone about what I saw, not until years later. It was the summer of '84, and we were having a big family picnic at my grandparents' place. I was 20 by then, home from college for the summer. After dinner, the men had gathered around the grill with beers, telling hunting stories. My dad, my two uncles, and my grandfather were there, and I was sitting nearby, half listening. That's when I heard my Uncle Mike mention something that made my blood run cold. He was telling a story about a hunting trip they'd taken in the early '70s, before our house was even built, back when the whole area was mostly undeveloped. He described how they'd been tracking a deer when they came across something that shouldn't exist. My dad jumped in, saying they'd seen not just one, but a group of them. Tall, white-haired creatures that had looked at them for a moment before disappearing into the thicker forest. They all laughed it off, saying they'd probably just seen some albino deer or maybe had too many beers in their hunting packs. But I saw their faces. They weren't really laughing. There was this tension underneath. I don't know what came over me, but I walked over and blurted out what had happened to me back in '76. The laughter stopped immediately. My dad and uncles looked at me with these serious expressions that confirmed everything. My grandfather shook his head and walked away, muttering something about things best left alone. Later that night, my dad came to talk to me. He apologized for never warning me specifically about those woods. He said they'd convinced themselves it was just their imagination, and they didn't want to scare me with campfire stories. But he didn't dismiss what I'd seen, not like others had when I'd cautiously brought it up a few times over the years. "There are things in this world we don't understand, Emily," he said. "Sometimes it's better not to look too hard for explanations." I've done research over the years. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and other cryptids. Some accounts match what I saw, others don't. What I saw wasn't the brown, ape-like creature from the famous Patterson-Gimlin film. This was different, whiter, stranger somehow. That part of Ohio has been built up a lot since then. Those woods are mostly gone now, replaced by subdivisions and strip malls. Sometimes I wonder if whatever I saw that day is still out there, pushed further, into the shrinking wild places, or if it was the last of its kind, already a ghost when I encountered it. I'm 47 now, with kids of my own. We live in Michigan, far from those Ohio woods. I've never told my children this story. How could I? What would be the point? But sometimes when they want to explore the wooded area behind our current home, I feel that same ice in my veins. I let them go, but I always set boundaries, invisible lines they must not cross. I don't know what I saw that day in 1976. I don't have a name for it or an explanation, but I know it was real. I know it changed me, and I know that when I walk in forests now, even all these decades later, I'm always listening, always watching the spaces between trees, always ready to run. Because once you've seen something that shouldn't exist, you never stop looking for it. And you never stop fearing that it might be looking for you too. Story 2. I've been trying to figure out how to write this down for months. It happened last year in October, and I'm still trying to process it. I own a small cattle ranch in western Montana, about 30 miles from the nearest town and surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides. It's not a big operation, just 28 head of cattle on 120 acres that's been in my family for 3 generations. That morning started like any other. I woke up around 5:30, made coffee, and watched the sunrise from my porch like I always do. The weather had turned cold that week, with frost covering the ground each morning, and I remember thinking I should check the feed levels since the cattle were eating more as winter approached. After finishing my morning chores around the barn, I decided to check the feed bin at the edge of my property. I keep a large metal bin about 50 yards from the tree line where I store supplemental feed. It's far enough from the house that I usually take my ATV down there, but that morning I felt like walking. I had my 38 on my hip like I always do when I'm working the property, not because I'm paranoid, just a habit from years of living in the middle of nowhere. You never know when you might encounter a mountain lion or an aggressive coyote. As I was walking down the path toward the feed bin, I noticed something wasn't right. The bin's lid was open, which was strange because I always close it to keep critters out. At first, I thought maybe a bear had gotten into it. We get black bears occasionally, and they can figure out how to open things if they're hungry enough. But as I got closer, maybe 75 yards away, I realized whatever was at my feed bin was much bigger than a black bear. I slowed down, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was something sitting with its back to me, hunched over the feed bin. Even sitting down, it was massive. I stopped about 25 yards away, frozen in place. That's when the smell hit me. God, that smell. I've been around livestock my whole life. I've dealt with every kind of animal mess you can imagine, but this was different. It was this overpowering, musky stench, like wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. The thing was eating the cattle feed, scooping it up with what looked like hands. Its back was covered in dark, matted hair, not fur like a bear, but hair almost like human hair but thicker and dirtier. It was a dark brown color, almost black in places. I must have made some noise because suddenly it stopped moving. I remember holding my breath, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Slowly, this thing turned its head to look over its shoulder at me. I've never felt so small in my life. When it turned, I could see part of its face. Not clearly, but enough to know it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. It had deep-set eyes under a heavy brow. I couldn't make out much detail from that distance, but those eyes locked onto mine, and I swear they were evaluating me. Then it stood up. Jesus Christ, when it stood up. I'm 6'1", and this thing towered over me. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It was broad too, with massive shoulders and long arms. The hair covered its entire body except for parts of its face and what looked like the palms of its hands. For what felt like forever, we just stared at each other. I remember thinking about the pistol on my hip, but 2 thoughts stopped me from reaching for it. First, I honestly didn't feel threatened. As terrifying as this thing was, it wasn't acting aggressive, just curious, or maybe cautious. Second, I had the distinct feeling that my 38 would do nothing but piss it off. It was like standing in front of a tank and holding a slingshot. The whole time, it was looking at me with this intelligence. That's what really got to me. This wasn't just an animal reacting on instinct. It was thinking, assessing, deciding what to do about me. After what must have been 30 seconds but felt like hours, it seemed to make a decision. It turned away from me, still standing at its full height, and with just a few strides, it disappeared into the tree line. I don't mean it ran away. It was just gone. vanished into the forest like something that size had no right to do. The silence afterward was deafening. I stood there for I don't know how long, unable to move. My legs felt like they were made of cement. Eventually, I managed to back away slowly, never turning my back to the woods, until I was far enough away that I felt safe to turn and walk quickly back to my house. Once inside, I locked the door behind me, something I rarely do out here, and poured myself a whiskey with shaking hands. It was barely 9 in the morning. I sat at my kitchen table, staring out the window toward the tree line for hours, trying to process what I'd seen. I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but I've seen plenty of bears, and this was no bear. The way it moved, the shape of its body, those eyes, no way. Some guy in a costume, out here, miles from anywhere, digging through my cattle feed, and no costume could account for that smell or that size. After a few hours, I worked up the courage to go back out there. I took my rifle this time, a .30-06 that would stop a lot more than my pistol. The feed bin was a mess. About half the feed was gone, and there were what looked like handprints in the feed that remained. Massive handprints with 5 fingers, not a bear's paw print. Around the bin, I found footprints in the soft earth. They were huge, easily 18 inches long, and clearly showed 5 toes. They looked almost human, but wider, and with a different shape to the arch. I followed the tracks to the tree line, but they disappeared once they hit the pine needle-covered forest floor. I searched the edge of the woods for about an hour, but found nothing else. That night, I barely slept. I kept the rifle by my bed and woke up at every sound. The next day, I drove into town and asked around if anyone had reported seeing anything strange. No one had, though old Tom at the general store gave me a funny look and asked if I'd seen something up in the hills. When I hesitated, he just nodded and said, "Those mountains keep their secrets. Best leave it that way." I've spent months trying to make sense of what happened. I've researched online, read books about unidentified creatures, even discreetly reached out to a university professor who studies wildlife in the region. Nothing fits exactly what I saw. What keeps me up at night isn't just the creature itself, but the way it behaved. It wasn't mindless or purely instinctual. It made a decision about me. It assessed the threat I posed and determined I wasn't worth its trouble. That level of reasoning is what truly terrifies me. Because if something like that exists out there in the woods, something that big, that strong, with that kind of intelligence, what else don't we know about? I've thought about reporting it officially, but what would I say? Who would believe me? I don't have proof. I didn't take pictures. Honestly, pulling out my phone to snap a photo was the furthest thing from my mind in that moment. All I have is what I saw with my own eyes. I still run my cattle operation. I still check the feed bin every day. But I never go near the edge of the forest without my rifle now, and I never go at dusk or dawn. I installed trail cameras around my property, but they haven't caught anything unusual. Sometimes at night, I think I hear heavy footsteps outside, but when I look, there's never anything there. Maybe it's my imagination working overtime. Maybe not. I don't know what I encountered that day. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, some undiscovered species. The name doesn't really matter. What matters is that it's out there, and it's smart enough to stay hidden, smart enough to assess a threat, smart enough to decide when to retreat, and smart enough to know that the woods are its domain, not mine. I haven't seen it since that October morning, but sometimes when the wind blows in from the forest, I catch that smell again. And I know it's still out there, watching and waiting. I just hope it continues to decide I'm not worth the trouble, because we both know which one of us would win that fight. Story 3. I've been carrying this around for way too long, 35 years to be exact, summer of '88. I was 16 and stupid, but not stupid enough to imagine what happened that night. Let me start by saying Sandpoint was a different place back then. Small logging town in northern Idaho, where everybody knew everybody's business. Me, Tyler, Zach, and Connor had been friends since elementary school. We weren't troublemakers. Exactly. But the local cops definitely knew Zach and me by name. Nothing serious, just the usual teenage crap like skateboarding where we shouldn't and getting caught with cigarettes. That Saturday in July started like any other summer day. Hot as hell, nothing to do. Connor's older brother had made this blackberry wine that was sitting in their garage, and Connor swiped a bottle when no one was looking. It wasn't much, maybe enough for each of us to get a slight buzz. But we were bored, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. We needed somewhere private to drink it. You got to understand, in a town like Sandpoint, if we got caught drinking underage, everyone would know within hours. My dad would have grounded me until college, and Zach was already on thin ice with his parents after getting caught joyriding in his dad's truck the month before. "Let's take the logging road up past Sagal," Zach suggested. He had his mom's old Chevy Impala for the night, one of those huge boats from the 70s, with bench seats and a trunk you could fit a couch in. The spot we picked was this turnout about 7 miles up this unmarked logging road near Kaniksu National Forest. Just a small clearing surrounded by these massive pines that blocked out most of the evening sky. We parked, killed the engine, and passed the bottle around while cranking Metallica on the car stereo. The wine tasted like crap, sour and way too sweet at the same time. We each had maybe 2 small cups worth, just enough to feel a little warm, nowhere near drunk. I remember Connor complaining it wasn't worth stealing. Time got away from us. We weren't paying attention until Zach suddenly looked at his watch and freaked out. "Shit, it's almost 10. My mom needs the car back by 10:30. We scrambled to clean up, tossing the empty bottle deep into the woods and brushing pine needles off our clothes. The drive back to town would take at least 25 minutes if we hurried. The forest was pitch black as we headed. Down the winding dirt road, headlights cutting through the darkness. Zach was pushing it a little too fast on the curves, making the tires slip on loose gravel. We hit the highway, Highway 95, heading south toward town around 10:15. It happened about 5 miles outside Sandpoint, right where the highway makes this wide, sweeping left-hand curve past some farmer's field. The road was completely empty, no other cars in sight. Just us and the darkness. I was in the passenger seat messing with the radio when I heard Connor from the back seat. "What the hell is that?" I looked up, just as our headlights swept across something on the right shoulder of the road. At first, I thought it was a bear hunched over roadkill. We'd seen plenty of those before, but something felt wrong immediately. It was massive, sure, but the shape was off. "Slow down," I said to Zach, but he was already easing off the gas, all of us leaning forward to get a better look. The thing was crouched right on the white line at the edge of the road. Completely black, not dark brown like a bear, but jet black, like it was absorbing the light from our headlights. It was hunched over something, and I remember thinking it looked like it was feeding. Then it turned its head toward us. I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. Its face caught the full beam of our headlights, and I realized with absolute certainty this was not a bear, not even close. The face was flat, almost like a gorilla's, but wrong. There was no snout like a bear would have, just this flat face with these eyes that reflected our headlights like 2 yellow-green discs. Before any of us could process what we were seeing, the thing stood up. In one smooth, fluid motion, not lumbering like a bear at all. It just unfolded itself from its crouching position. It was enormous. Standing fully upright, it had to be between 7 and 8 feet tall. Its arms hung down to its knees, and its entire body was covered in this thick, shaggy, black hair. Not fur, hair. Long and matted in places. It wasn't wearing clothes, but it wasn't like looking at a naked animal either. The proportions were all wrong. Too human in some ways, too inhuman in others. For maybe 2 seconds, it just stood there, staring directly at us as we drove toward it. I swear to God it tilted its head slightly, like it was curious about us. Then it took 2 massive strides, not running, just walking with purpose, and disappeared into the tree line. 2 steps, that's all it took to cross what had to be 15 feet of roadside clearing. All 3 of us started screaming at once. Connor was yelling, "Go, go, go!" from the back seat. Zach stomped on the gas, and the Impala's old V8 roared as we shot past the spot where it had been standing. "What the fuck was that?" Zach kept saying over and over, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "What the actual fuck was that?" "Did you guys see that?" Connor's voice was high-pitched, almost breaking. "Tell me you saw that." "I saw it," I managed to say. My mouth had gone completely dry. "That wasn't a bear." "No shit, it wasn't a bear." Zach was borderline hysterical now. "Bears don't stand up like that. Bears don't move like that." We spent the rest of the drive back to town trying to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was someone in a costume. But who would be out there miles from town, standing on the highway at night? And nobody could move that fast in a costume. Maybe it was some kind of escaped zoo animal. But there wasn't a zoo anywhere near Sandpoint. By the time we hit the town limits, we'd stopped trying to explain it and started worrying about a more immediate problem: whether to tell anyone. "We can't," Zach said flatly. "We'd have to explain why we were out there in the first place." "So what?" Connor argued. "We just had a little blackberry wine. It's not like we were wasted." "Doesn't matter," I said. "My dad would kill me just for having a sip. And Zach's already on probation, at home. Plus, who's gonna believe us?" Zach added. "They'll think we were hallucinating or making it up for attention." We swore each other to secrecy that night. Promised we wouldn't tell a soul. Not our friends, not our parents, not even the local newspaper that always ran stories about weird sightings in the woods. We dropped Connor off first, then Zach took me home before returning the car to his mum. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing standing in our headlights, staring at us with those reflective eyes. I kept imagining it following me home, looking in through my bedroom window. Around dawn, I finally dozed off from sheer exhaustion. The next day, we met up at the burger dock downtown, all looking like zombies. None of us had slept. "Did that really happen?" Connor asked quietly, pushing his fries around his plate. Zach nodded slowly. "You know it did." "But what was it?" I asked. Neither of them answered. We never went back to check the spot in daylight, never tried to find tracks or evidence. We were too scared, and we kept our pact of silence for years. We didn't even discuss it much among ourselves after a while. It was easier to pretend it never happened than to face the fact that we had no explanation for what we'd seen. Life went on. We finished high school. Connor went to college in Oregon. Zach joined the army. I stayed in Sandpoint working construction with my dad before eventually taking over his business. We drifted apart the way friends do. I kept that secret for 15 years. Never told a soul, not even my wife. Then, at a family Christmas gathering in 2003, after a few too many eggnogs, I finally broke down and told the story. My parents, my sister, and her husband, my wife. They all sat there in stunned silence as I recounted every detail. I expected them to laugh or tell me I'd imagined the whole thing. Instead, my sister Julie went completely pale. She looked at her husband, Mark, who nodded slowly. "We saw it too," she said quietly. "You could have heard a pin drop in that room." My dad started to say something, but Julie cut him off. "Winter of '95. Mark and I were driving you and Mom back from Pine Stump Junction, remember? That big snowstorm was starting." My parents nodded, looking confused. "It was almost dark," she continued. "We were coming around that same curve, and something stood up from behind a snowbank on the side of the road. Just like Tyler described, huge, black, not a bear. We only saw it for a second as we drove past, but we all looked at each other, knowing what we'd seen wasn't normal." "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Julie shrugged. "Same reason as you, I guess. Who would believe us? and after a while, you start to doubt yourself. After that night, I started doing research. Turns out, there have been dozens of similar sightings in northern Idaho and eastern Washington over the years. Most people keep quiet about them, afraid of being ridiculed. But they're out there if you look. Reports of something tall, black and bipedal, moving through the forests with impossible speed and silence. I tried contacting Zach and Connor a few years back to see if they'd be willing to go on record about what we saw. Connor never responded to my messages. Zach called me back, but as soon as I mentioned that night, he shut down. "I don't talk about that," he said flatly. "I've spent 30 years trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Don't drag me back there." I understand how he feels. Some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, seeing those reflective eyes staring into the car. I've driven past that curve on Highway 95 countless times since then, always in daylight, always looking at the tree line, wondering if it's watching me. I don't know what we saw that night in '88. I don't have a name for it. All I know is that 3 stone-cold, sober teenagers witnessed something impossible on a dark stretch of highway, and it changed us forever. Sometimes I think about going back there at night to see if it's still out there, but then I remember how it moved, how effortlessly it covered that distance in just 2 strides. And I know better. Whatever's waiting in those woods, it's been there a lot longer than us, and it'll be there long after we're gone. Story 4. I still get goosebumps thinking about that night at Skookum Flats. This happened back in 2003, when I was 17. Me and my friends were just doing what teenagers in small towns do, hanging out in our cars, talking shit and killing time. Our town in southwest Washington wasn't exactly the entertainment capital of the world, you know. There were 8 of us that night. Me, Daniel, Brian, Jess, Mike, Tyler, Amanda, Caitlin, and Chris. We'd usually park at this lookout point just outside town, but the cops had been cracking down lately. Officer Dawson had already moved us along twice that week, telling us to find somewhere else to loiter. So around 10 that night, after getting shooed away again, we headed to our backup spot, Skookum Flats. If you're not from around here, Skookum Flats is this clearing near the Cowlitz River, about 15 minutes out of town. The locals have all kinds of stories about the place, Native American legends, ghost sightings, weird shit in the woods. We never really took it seriously. It was just a good spot where we could park without anyone bothering us. That night was unusually cold for early October, probably low 40s. The fog was rolling in thick off the creek bend nearby, giving everything this eerie, muffled feeling. We parked our 4 cars in a row, facing this steep slope that went up at about a 45-degree angle. The slope was covered in brush and these tall Douglas firs that disappeared into darkness beyond our headlights. We kept our cars running for the heat, with the headlights on to see each other. 3 of the cars were nose out facing the slope, with the headlights providing this dim yellow glow that only reached the first few trees, maybe 40 or 50 feet ahead. We were just hanging out, listening to music, passing around some beers that Mike's older brother had bought us. Nothing crazy. I remember I was sitting on the hood of my Honda Civic, wearing this thick hoodie my mom had just bought me because I kept forgetting my jacket. Brian and Tyler were leaning against Brian's Subaru. Jess and Amanda were sitting inside Tyler's car with the door open, and the others were kind of just milling around between vehicles. We must have been there for hours. I remember checking my phone around 2:15 in the morning and thinking we should probably head home soon. The conversation had shifted to college applications. Most of us were seniors and stressing about what came next. The music had died down, and we were just talking in that lazy, late-night way when you're tired, but not quite ready to call it a night. That's when it happened. It was about 2:30 when I first heard it. The conversation just kind of naturally died down, and in that moment of quiet, there was this sound from the brush directly ahead of us, up on the slope. At first, it was just a soft crackling, like maybe a raccoon or something moving through the underbrush, but then it intensified, quickly, into this heavy crashing, like someone was barreling down the hill through the brush. I remember looking at Brian, and he was already staring at the tree line with this what the fuck expression. Everyone stopped talking. The sounds got louder, more urgent, branches snapping, leaves crunching, that distinct sound of something big moving fast through dense forest. Then came this loud thud as something huge hit the gravel in front of us, just at the edge of where our headlights reached. It landed with enough force that I felt the vibration through the hood of my car. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a second, nobody moved or said anything. Then I saw it, this massive, dark shape hunched over in the center of our headlight beams. It was just standing there, partially illuminated, partially in shadow. Brian was the first to react. He jumped into his car and flipped on his high beams. I did the same, scrambling off my hood and hitting my brights through the driver's window. With the additional light, we could make out its outline more clearly, and what I saw, fuck, I still have trouble describing it. It was tall, way taller than any person I'd ever seen, and wide, with proportions that just weren't human. The thing was too thick, too broad, like a linebacker wearing a fur coat, but bigger. Its arms hung low, almost to its knees, and its shoulders were massive, hunched up around where its neck should be. I couldn't make out facial features from the distance, just this dark, hulking silhouette. For what felt like forever, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds, it just stood there, caught in our headlights. Then it moved. The way it moved. Jesus. It turned and sprinted away down the road, but not like a person runs. It was too fluid, too fast for something that size. And its feet, they were bare. I could see that much. No shoes, no boots, just these large, pale feet slapping against the gravel road. The weird thing was, it made almost no sound as it ran. Just the heavy echo of its footsteps, which seemed to hang in the air even after it disappeared from view. Nobody screamed, nobody said a word. It was like we were all in shock. After it was gone, Mike whispered, "What the fuck was that?" His voice sounded so small. I don't know what possessed me, but I got out of my car. Brian and Tyler did too. We walked forward a short distance, maybe 20 feet, toward where it had been standing. The gravel was disturbed, like something heavy had landed there. There was this smell in the air, kind of musky, like wet dog, but stronger, more wild. We didn't go any further. Something in my gut told me not to. We walked back to the cars, and without discussing it, we all just left. One by one, we started our engines and drove away. Nobody raced out of there. It was almost eerily calm, how we just filed out in a line and headed back to town. I think we were all too stunned to panic. The drive home was a blur. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white, constantly checking my rear-view mirror. When I got home, I went straight to my room and lay in bed staring at the ceiling until sunrise, replaying what I'd seen over and over. The weirdest part? None of us talked about it. Not the next day, not the next week. It was like this unspoken agreement to pretend it never happened. I'd see Brian or Jess in the hallway at school, and we'd just nod at each other, no mention of that night. I think we were all afraid, not just of what we'd seen, but of saying it out loud, making it real. It wasn't until months later, around Christmas break, when we were all hanging out at Mike's house, that someone finally brought it up. We'd been drinking a little, and Caitlin just blurted out, "So are we ever going to talk about what we saw at Skookum Flats?" The room went silent. Then, one by one, we started sharing what we remembered. The crazy thing was, we all remembered it exactly the same way. The crashing through the brush, the thud as it landed, the massive shape in the headlights, the way it ran off. 8 different people with the exact same recollection. Later that winter, there was a story in the local paper about some guy who found large footprints in the snow about 5 miles south of Skookum Flats. The prints were apparently big, like 18 inches long, and too far apart to be made by a normal person. The article kind of made light of it, implying it was probably a hoax or someone with homemade stilts. But then more stories started coming out. The local news even ran a couple segments about strange sightings in the Cowlitz River Valley. People were reporting weird noises at night, livestock acting spooked, glimpses of something large moving through the trees at dusk. I've never told this story outside our friend group. People are quick to dismiss this kind of thing as bullshit or attention-seeking. And maybe if I'd been alone that night, I'd have convinced myself I imagined it or that it was just a bear or something. But 8 of us saw it. 8 different people who still, to this day, get this look in their eyes when Skookum Flats comes up in conversation. I'm 28 now. I moved away for college, but came back to the area a few years ago. I've never gone back to Skookum Flats at night. I've driven past it in daylight, and it just looks like any other clearing by the road. Nothing special, nothing scary, but I know what's out there, or what was out there that night. Sometimes I still wake up from dreams where I'm sitting on my car hood, and I hear that crashing coming down the slope toward me. In the dreams, I can never move. I just sit there as the sound gets closer and closer. I always wake up before I see it. I don't know what we encountered that night. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, some unknown species, or something else entirely. All I know is that it was real, it was massive, and it changed how I see the woods around here forever. When I hike now, I find myself constantly scanning the tree line, listening for that distinctive sound of something large moving through brush. Whatever it was, it's still out there. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick off the river and the night gets quiet, I swear I can hear those heavy footsteps echoing in the distance. Story 5. I've never been the type to believe in unexplainable things. I'm a logical person. I work, construction, hunt elk every fall, and spend my weekends riding snowmobiles with my buddies. But what happened in early March of 2022 changed everything I thought I knew about the world. I'm still trying to make sense of it. It started pretty normally. My Polaris RMK had gotten stuck the weekend before in some deep powder up in the Medina Mountains near Libby. If you know Montana backcountry in winter, you know getting stuck happens. Usually I can dig myself out, but this time I'd buried it so deep in a drift I couldn't manage alone. The snow was chest deep in spots, and after an hour of digging, I was exhausted and running out of daylight. I had to mark the GPS coordinates and hike back to where my truck was parked. So the following weekend, I convinced my 2 riding buddies, Dave and Mike, to help me retrieve it. We loaded up early Saturday morning when it was still dark, coffee thermoses filled, sleds on the trailer. The drive up Forest Service Road was slow going with all the ice, but we got to the trailhead around 8 in the morning. The mountains were stunning that day. Fresh snow had fallen midweek, and the sky was this perfect clear blue. Temperature was cold though, maybe 15 degrees when we started out. We had to follow my tracks from the previous weekend, which were partly filled in with new snow, but still visible enough to follow. The route to my buried sled wasn't easy. We had to navigate across a couple of steep ridges, through some dense timber, and traverse areas where the snow had drifted 6 to 8 feet deep. It's remote country. You don't see other riders out there often, especially that far back. We'd been riding for about an hour and a half when we finally reached the general area where my sled was buried. We stopped in this small clearing, kind of a natural meadow that ran alongside a creek. The creek was mostly frozen over, but you could still hear water moving underneath in spots. We figured we'd take a quick break before the hard work of digging out my sled, which was buried about a quarter mile ahead. Dave and Mike pulled off their helmets and were bullshitting about something, probably giving me grief about getting stuck in the first place. I was standing up, stretching my back after being hunched over the handlebars for so long. That's when I happened to look across the meadow. At first, I didn't register what I was seeing. About 200 yards away, at the edge of the meadow, where some lodgepole pines created a shadow line, was something. It wasn't a tree, it wasn't a stump. It was a figure, standing completely still, facing directly toward us. My brain tried to process it. Bear? No, Bears are hibernating in March and it was standing fully upright. Moose? No, wrong shape entirely. Another rider. No gear, no sled, and who would just stand there in waist-deep snow? I felt the hair on my arms stand up despite the layers I was wearing. The figure was massive, way bigger than a human. It looked almost like a gorilla, but more upright, more human-shaped in its posture. Its shoulders were incredibly wide, maybe 3 feet across, and its arms hung straight down at its sides. The head seemed small compared to those shoulders, almost like it didn't have a neck at all. I could see dark hair or fur covering most of its body, black or maybe dark grey, and where the sun hit it along the edges, there was this slight sheen to it. But what really stood out was its chest and upper body. The chest muscles were defined, not like fat, but like muscle, and the upper chest area seemed to have less hair, showing what looked like dark grey skin underneath. I just stood there staring. I couldn't move. I felt this weird pressure in my chest, like when you know something's fundamentally wrong but can't explain it. It was watching us. I'm certain of that. It didn't move at all, not swaying, not shifting weight like a person normally would, just perfectly still. After what felt like forever, but was probably 30 seconds, I finally found my voice and whispered to Dave, "Hey, look over there. Do you see that?" Dave turned and followed where I was pointing. He froze immediately. "Holy shit," he whispered. "That's not a bear." Mike was still messing with his gloves and hadn't noticed yet. Dave and I just stood there staring at this thing across the meadow. It was so out of place, so wrong. The stillness was unnerving. Nothing that big should be able to stand that motionless for that long. "What the hell is that?" Dave whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know." We watched it for over a minute. It never moved, not once. We were too far away to make out facial features, but I could tell it was facing directly at us. I had this overwhelming feeling of being observed, like it was studying us as much as we were studying it. Mike finally looked up. "What are you guys looking at?" Dave pointed, and Mike went quiet. "Jesus," he finally said, "is that what I think it is?" None of us said the word. We didn't have to. We all knew what we were thinking. Here's the weird part. I wasn't exactly scared. Unsettled, yes. Confused, definitely. But it wasn't acting aggressive. It was just present, watching. And that was somehow more disturbing than if it had been charging at us. "Should we try to get closer? Get a picture?" Mike asked, reaching for his phone. "No," I said immediately, surprising myself with how certain I felt. "No, let's just stick to why we came, get my sled and head back the same way." Dave nodded in agreement. "It's not threatening us. Let's leave it be." We reluctantly turned away and headed to where my snowmobile was buried. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, but the figure remained in the same spot, motionless. The work of digging out my sled took us about 2 hours. The entire time, I kept feeling like we were being watched, even though we couldn't see the meadow from where we were working. Once we got my sled free, we took a different route back, deliberately passing by that same meadow. I was both hoping and dreading to see the figure again. But when we got there, it was gone, completely vanished. We stopped and scanned the tree line. Nothing. The meadow was empty except for pristine snow. What struck me immediately was the lack of tracks. There were no footprints crossing our trail or heading into the trees. Nothing disturbing the snow where it had been standing. And this was in waist-deep snow, where anything moving would leave obvious signs. "Where did it go?" Mike asked. Dave shook his head. "I don't know, but I'm not getting off my sled to find out." I agreed. We fired up our engines and headed back toward the trailhead. The ride back was tense. None of us talked much. We kept scanning the trees as we rode, half expecting to see it again. But we didn't. It wasn't until we were loading the sleds onto the trailer that we finally discussed what we'd seen. We were all experienced outdoorsmen. Between the three of us, we had spent countless days in the Montana backcountry. We know what bears look like, what moose look like, what elk look like. This wasn't any of those. That was a Sasquatch, Mike finally said, saying what we'd all been thinking. Had to be. I'd never believed in Bigfoot before. Always thought it was bullshit stories and misidentified bears. But standing there in the parking lot, I couldn't deny what I'd seen. The proportions were all wrong for any animal I knew. The way it stood, perfectly upright and completely still. The massive shoulders, the defined chest muscles, the dark skin showing through the hair. Dave was quiet for a long time before saying, "We saw something, that's for sure. And whatever it was, it's not in any wildlife guide I've ever read." The location is what keeps coming back to me. This wasn't some easily accessible area where someone could have been playing a prank. You need serious snowmobiling skills to get back there in winter. There were no other tracks at the trailhead that day. No one else was up there, and the way it disappeared without leaving tracks. I can't explain that. It's been over a year now, and I still think about it almost daily. I've gone back to that spot several times in different seasons, never alone, but haven't seen anything unusual again. I've researched Bigfoot sightings in Montana and found reports from the Cabinet Mountains going back decades. Some descriptions match what we saw almost exactly. Dave and I have talked about it many times, Mike less so. He seems to want to forget it happened. I understand that. Sometimes I wish I could forget too. But how do you forget something that fundamentally changes how you see the world? I don't tell many people this story. Most would think we were making it up or had confused a bear with something else. But I know what I saw. Dave knows what he saw. That thing in the meadow was real. It was intelligent. It was watching us. And sometimes, when I'm riding alone in the backcountry, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. I don't have answers. I just know that on that clear March day in 2022, in a remote meadow in the Cabinet Mountains, I saw something that shouldn't exist. And now I have to live with the knowledge that there are things in this world beyond what most of us are willing to accept. Story 6. I've been debating for weeks whether to post this. I guess I need to get it off my chest, even if nobody believes me. This happened to me over 15 years ago in July of 2008, but I remember every second like it was yesterday. I've only told my family and a couple of close friends who I trust wouldn't laugh in my face. But I can't keep carrying this alone anymore. I was 20 years old back then, living with my dad in Skookum County, New York. It was a Friday night, and I'd been hanging out with some buddies in town. Nothing crazy, just playing video games and shooting the shit. I left around 11:30 at night to head home. If you've never been to this part of New York, it's nothing like the city. It's rural, lots of forests, winding roads, and not a lot of streetlights. Black Creek Road was my usual route home, a narrow two-lane road that cuts through dense woods for miles. During the day, it's peaceful. At night, it's pitch black except for your headlights. The radio was playing some song I can't remember, and I was just focused on getting home. I wasn't drunk or high or anything. I need to make that clear. I was completely sober, wide awake, and alert. The moon was almost full that night, but the tree canopy was so thick that the road stayed dark. I was about halfway home, doing maybe 45 miles per hour, when my headlights caught something moving on the right side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer. We get them all the time, and hitting one can total your car. So I slowed down a bit, expecting it to bolt across the road like they usually do. But this wasn't a deer. As it stepped onto the edge of the road, I realized it was walking upright, on two legs. My first thought was, oh, it's just some guy walking along the road. Except we were miles from anywhere. Who walks on Black Creek Road at midnight? As it moved further into my headlights, I felt this cold wave wash over me. This thing was massive, not just tall but big, wide, and covered completely in dark hair or fur, long hair. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like my thoughts were skipping, trying to make sense of it. The strangest part was how it moved. It wasn't rushing to get across the road. It was deliberate, calm, like it had all the time in the world, like it didn't care that a car was coming straight at it. I instinctively slowed down more, not knowing what to do. As I got closer, I could better gauge its size. This thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, like a linebacker but bigger. The hair on its arms hung down, noticeably longer than the hair on the rest of its body. I remember that detail so clearly because it struck me as so strange. The hair swayed slightly as it moved. I was maybe 30 feet away when it did something that still gives me nightmares. It stopped walking. Right there, just a few feet from the edge of the pavement on the driver's side. My side. It didn't run into the woods. It didn't charge at my car. It just stopped and waited. My car kept moving forward, slower now, maybe 20 miles per hour. I was too shocked to stop completely, too afraid to do anything but keep driving. As I passed within feet of this thing, this creature, it turned its head and upper body toward me in this fluid, unnervingly casual motion. It looked directly into my car, directly at me. I couldn't see its face clearly. The hair partly obscured it, and the angle of my headlights created more shadows than illumination from that position. But I could feel its eyes on me. I know that sounds crazy, but I felt its gaze like a physical weight. The whole encounter probably lasted less than 10 seconds, but time seemed to stretch. I didn't speed up until I was past it. Then I floored it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the car on the road. I kept checking my rearview mirror, terrified I'd see it running after me, but the road behind me was empty. When I got home, I burst through the door, startling my dad, who was watching TV in the living room. He said I was white as a sheet, sweating and trembling. I couldn't even speak properly at first. I just kept saying, "You won't believe what I saw. You won't believe it." When I finally calmed down enough to tell him, I could see he was concerned, not about what I'd seen, but about me. He asked if I'd been drinking, if I'd taken something. That made me angry. I told him I was stone cold sober and knew exactly what I saw. It wasn't a bear, I told him. Bears don't walk upright for that long, and they don't move like that. It wasn't a guy in a suit. Nobody would be out there in a costume at midnight on a deserted road. And the proportions were all wrong. No human is built like that. The way it moved, it was too natural, too fluid. My dad didn't say much after that. I think he believed that I believed what I saw, if that makes sense. But I could tell he was searching for some rational explanation. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing turning to look at me. The casual way it moved, like it wasn't afraid of me at all. Like it was curious. That's what bothered me the most. The intelligence behind that movement. It wasn't the behavior of a startled animal. It was deliberate, calculated. The next morning, my dad suggested we drive back to that spot to look for tracks or evidence. Part of me wanted to, but a bigger part refused to go anywhere near Black Creek Road in the daylight, let alone at night. I was terrified of what we might find. Or worse, what might find us. For weeks afterward, I took the long way home, adding 20 minutes to my drive just to avoid that stretch of road. I researched local wildlife, trying to convince myself it was just a bear or some other animal seen from a weird angle. But nothing fit. I knew what I saw. I also looked into local legends and folklore. Turns out Herkimer County has had a few strange sightings over the years. Nothing officially documented, just stories people tell. Hunters claiming to have seen something big moving through the trees. Hikers finding strange footprints. Campers hearing unusual sounds at night, but nothing concrete enough to validate what I experienced. What haunts me most is the creature's behavior. If it was some kind of undiscovered animal, why didn't it run away from my car? Wild animals usually avoid human contact. But this thing stopped and watched me, almost like it wanted me to see it, like it was making a decision to be seen. And if it was something else, why show itself to me? Just some random guy driving home? What was the purpose? I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was a person playing a prank, though that makes no sense given the location and time. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion created by shadows and my headlights. Maybe I experienced some kind of hallucination, though I've never had any before or since. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. It was solid. It had mass and presence. It moved with purpose. I've avoided telling this story publicly because I know how it sounds. I'd probably think someone was full of shit if they told me this story, but I know what I experienced. That thing, whatever it was not supposed to exist. Not in our world. Not on a lonely road in upstate New York. I drive that route occasionally now. I had to get over my fear eventually, but I never do it at night, and I always feel my heart rate pick up when I pass that specific stretch of road. My eyes scan the tree line involuntarily, looking for movement. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, if it watches the cars pass by from the safety of the trees, if it remembers me like I remember it. The strangest part is that I don't know if I'm more afraid of seeing it again or of never knowing what it really was. That uncertainty has changed me. I used to think we understood the world we live in. Now I'm not so sure. I still haven't found an explanation for what happened that night. Maybe I never will. But whatever I saw on Black Creek Road was real, and it saw me too. Story 7. I've lived my whole life next to these woods in northern Arkansas, and I still don't know what's out there watching us, but it's there. It's always been there. Our property sits at the end of a long gravel road, with about 3 acres of cleared land surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides. The house itself is nothing special, just an old farmhouse my parents bought dirt cheap back in the 90s. My dad fixed it up over the years, adding a big wraparound porch where we spend most summer evenings. But no matter how cozy it feels on that porch with the string lights my mom hung up, I never fully relax. Not with those woods so close. The first time I noticed something wasn't right, I was maybe 8 or 9. I was playing in the yard near dusk when I felt it, that sensation of being watched. I remember looking toward the tree line and seeing nothing but shadows between the trunks. But I knew something was there. I ran inside and told my mom, who just said it was probably a deer or maybe one of the neighbor's dogs. But deep down, I think she knew better. As I got older, the incidents became more frequent and harder to dismiss. The footsteps were the first concrete evidence. Anyone walking along our property line near the woods would hear them. Heavy footfalls matching their pace, always just out of sight, always stopping when you stopped. My high school friends thought it was hilarious when they'd visit, until they heard it themselves. One friend, Jessica, refused to ever come back after something followed her all the way from the woods to our back door one night. The screams are the worst, though. They don't sound like anything that should exist in these hills, not like a bobcat or coyote or any animal I've ever heard. They start low and build to this awful pitch that makes your skin crawl. Sometimes they sound almost human, but wrong. Like someone trying to mimic human screams without understanding what they're supposed to sound like. We've heard them at all hours, but they're most common around 3 in the morning. I've woken up countless times to those sounds, paralyzed under my blankets, too scared to look out my window. My parents tried to rationalize it for years. Dad would say it was just the wind, or hunters messing around, or maybe some kind of rare bird. Mom would nod along, but I'd catch her making extra sure the doors were locked at night. We never really talked about it directly. It was just the noises, or that weird thing in the woods. Like giving it a name would make it more real. Last October is when everything changed. My boyfriend Ryan was visiting for the weekend. We'd been dating about 6 months, and he'd heard me mention the weird stuff around our property, but thought I was exaggerating. That Friday night, we were sitting on the porch steps sharing a beer, don't tell my parents, and talking about nothing important. It was probably around 11 at night, cool but not cold, with this bright half moon lighting up the yard. Ryan was in the middle of telling me about his new job when we both heard it. Movement in the underbrush along the edge of the woods. Not the careful steps of a deer or the quick scuttle of a raccoon. This was heavy, deliberate, breaking branches, crushing leaves. Something big. "What's that?" Ryan whispered, suddenly tense beside me. "Just listen," I said. The sounds continued, paralleling the edge of our property. Whatever it was seemed to be pacing back and forth, never coming into the open, but never leaving either. Then Ryan made a huge mistake. He stood up suddenly and shouted, "Hey, who's there?" What happened next still gives me nightmares. The thing in the woods, and I'm absolutely certain now it was a thing, not a person, got spooked. There was this moment of complete silence and then chaos. It took off through the underbrush with a force that seemed impossible. The crashing sound was deafening, like something massive was plowing through the woods at incredible speed. Small trees were snapping, the ground literally shook. Ryan nearly fell backward onto the porch steps. "What the fuck was that?" he gasped, his face pale in the moonlight. I couldn't answer. Nothing that big should move that fast. Nothing natural, anyway. We ran inside and locked the doors. I called my parents, who were away visiting my aunt, and tried to explain what happened without sounding completely hysterical. Dad told me to make sure all the doors and windows were secure and promised they'd be home first thing in the morning. Ryan and I spent the night in the living room with all the lights on, jumping at every sound from outside. When my parents got home the next day, Dad went to check out the woods, where we'd heard the commotion. Even he couldn't explain away what he found, a path of destruction about 8 feet wide, with saplings snapped in half and deep impressions in the ground. He took pictures, but never showed them to anyone outside the family. For a few weeks after that, things were quiet, almost too quiet. No screams, no footsteps. Ryan broke up with me, by the way. Said he couldn't deal with the weird shit at my house. Can't really blame him. Then one night in early December, I was alone in the house. My parents had gone to a Christmas party at the church, and my sister was away at college. I was in my bedroom working on a paper for my online classes when I heard it, the snap of twigs right outside my window. My room is on the first floor, facing the side yard that leads to the woods. I froze, my fingers hovering over my laptop keyboard. Another snap, then another. Something was walking slowly, deliberately toward my window. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then came a sound that confirmed this wasn't just in my head, the distinctive sound of glass shattering. Something had stepped on an old Coke bottle that had been lying in the yard. Glass breaking, such a mundane sound, but it changed everything in my mind. Whatever was out there was solid enough, real enough, to break glass. This wasn't some ghost or figment of my imagination. This was something physical, moving through our yard. I finally found the courage to move, crawling across my floor to peek through the blinds. I saw nothing at first, just the dim yard illuminated by the security light on the corner of the house. Then movement caught my eye, something large shifting in the shadows by the big oak tree. It was too dark to make out details, but the shape was all wrong for a bear or deer. It stood upright, but the proportions weren't human. The arms seemed too long, the head oddly shaped. I dropped back to the floor, heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I called my parents, who were already on their way home. Then I called our nearest neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, who lives about half a mile down the road. He's an old hunter who's lived in these hills his whole life. He said he'd come right over with his shotgun. By the time my parents and Mr. Jenkins arrived, whatever had been in the yard was gone. But Mr. Jenkins wasn't surprised by my story. He sat at our kitchen table drinking the coffee my mom made and told us things I'll never forget. "Folks around here have been seeing things in these woods for generations," he said, his weathered face serious in the kitchen light. "My daddy used to call them the monkey people, said they lived deep in the hills where nobody goes. He told us how hunters regularly come back with stories they're almost too embarrassed to share. glimpses of ape-like creatures moving through the trees, strange structures made of broken branches high up in the forest canopy, areas where the wildlife goes completely silent for no apparent reason. "Most people who see something never talk about it," he said. "Who'd believe them? But it happens more than you'd think." His words brought back a memory my mom and sister had shared years ago, but that I'd almost forgotten. They were hanging laundry one evening when they spotted glowing red eyes under the apple tree near the edge of our property. When my mom called out, the thing stood up on two legs and ran off, not like a person running, but like an ape, my sister had said. Something silver-grey, disappearing into the darkness. My mum finally shared her own encounter from a few years back. She was driving home late one night when she saw something large by the roadside ditch, about a quarter-mile from our house. In the headlights, she caught a glimpse of a massive silver-grey creature that turned to look at her car before slipping into the woods. She said its eyes reflected the light like an animal's, but its body moved like a person's. She was too scared to stop or even mention it when she got home. Even my dad, the eternal skeptic, finally admitted there was something strange about our woods. He told us how he'd been checking our property line last spring and found a deer carcass high up in a tree fork, nearly 15 feet off the ground. No mountain lion or bear in these parts would do that. Word has gotten around about our woods over the years. Sometimes people from town will visit, asking if they can hang out after dark to hear the noises, like it's some kind of tourist attraction. A few have suggested setting up trail cameras to catch whatever's out there, but I've always resisted. Part of me doesn't want to know, like maybe seeing it clearly would make it worse somehow. The most recent incident was just last week. I was taking out the trash at dusk when I heard the familiar footsteps shadowing me from the tree line. But this time, there was something different, a smell, like wet fur and something rotten underneath. I dropped the trash bag and ran inside. That night, the screaming from the woods was louder than I've ever heard it. It went on for hours, moving around the perimeter of our property like whatever made the sound was pacing, agitated. My parents and I sat in the living room until dawn, not talking much, just listening. At one point, something hit the side of the house, hard enough to shake the windows. When we checked in the morning, we found a dent in the siding and tufts of coarse, grayish hair caught in the wood. Dad collected the hair in a plastic bag, but never sent it anywhere to be tested. I think he's afraid of the answer. I still live at home. I'm 22 now, taking online classes and working at the library in town. People ask why I don't move away, get my own place. How can I explain that despite everything I can't leave? This house, these woods, they're part of me now. And whatever's out there has been watching me my whole life. Sometimes I feel like it knows me, like we're connected somehow. Last night I sat on the porch steps alone, staring into the darkness of the tree line. "What are you?" I whispered. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then from deep in the woods came a single low vocalization. Not quite a growl, not quite a word, but somehow it felt like an answer. Story 8. I've been putting off writing about this for almost 3 years now. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I wanted to share this experience with anyone besides Zoe, who was there with me that night. We both still get chills talking about it. But after seeing other people post similar experiences, I figured maybe writing it down might help me process what happened, and maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. This happened in the Wichita Mountains in Arkansas back in 2020. Zoe and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We're both experienced hikers and campers. I've been doing it since I was a kid, and Zoe's former military, so she knows her way around the outdoors. I brought my 2 dogs, Rex, a German Shepherd mix who's great on trails, and Pippin, my Jack Russell Terrier who's absolutely fearless. That dog would chase a bear if I let him. We'd been camping for 3 days without any issues. Beautiful weather, great hiking, no other people around for miles. We'd picked a spot about 7 miles from the nearest trail access point, in a small clearing surrounded by dense woods. During the day, it was peaceful. Birds chirping, squirrels darting around, the works. At night, the usual forest sounds. Crickets, the occasional owl, nothing out of the ordinary. Until our last night. We'd hiked about 12 miles that day, so we were exhausted. We ate dinner around the campfire, then Zoe and I crawled into our shared tent around 10 p.m. The dogs came in with us, like they had the previous nights. Rex curled up by my feet, and Pippin took his usual spot between our sleeping bags. I remember checking my watch before falling asleep. It was 10:43 p.m. I woke up suddenly at what my watch said was 3:17 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The forest was dead silent. Not cricket silent or peaceful silent, but wrong silent. The kind of silence that makes the hair on your neck stand up. Then I heard it, a soft, strange vocalization coming from somewhere in the woods. It wasn't an animal call I recognized, and I've heard coyotes, bobcats, even mountain lions before. This was different, almost like someone trying to mimic a bird call but getting it wrong. A series of high-pitched whoops, followed by a low, guttural sound. It happened 3 times, then silence again. I reached for my flashlight, and that's when I felt something brush against the outside of our tent. Not like a branch or an animal bumping into it. It felt deliberate, like fingers, large fingers, slowly dragging across the nylon, starting from about halfway up the tent wall and moving horizontally for about 2 feet. My first thought was to check the dogs. In any normal situation, Rex would be on alert, growling at the tent entrance. Pippin would be barking his head off. That dog goes ballistic if a leaf blows across our yard at home. But both dogs were completely frozen. Rex was pressed against my sleeping bag, trembling so hard I could feel it. Pippin had somehow wedged himself completely under Zoe's sleeping bag, which I'd never seen him do before. Neither made a sound, not a growl, not a whimper, nothing. I didn't wake Zoe immediately. I just lay there, heart pounding so hard I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. The touching stopped, but I could sense something was still out there. It's hard to explain, but it felt like a presence, something massive just standing near the tent, watching. The air felt heavy, like right before a thunderstorm, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky earlier that night. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, I had to pee, badly. The kind of urgent need that can't wait until morning. I seriously considered just going in my sleeping bag. That's how terrified I was of leaving the tent. I'd rather clean up that mess than face whatever was outside. Just as I was weighing my options, Zoe stirred beside me. "Maya?" she whispered, so quietly I barely heard her. "Are you awake?" "Yeah," I whispered back. "I need to pee, but..." She trailed off. "Me too," I said, "but I don't want to go out there." "Did you hear anything?" she asked. I nodded, then realized she couldn't see me in the dark. "Yeah," and something touched the tent. She was quiet for a moment. "The dogs are acting weird." "I know." We both had our guns with us. Zoe carries a 9mm, and I had my dad's old .38 revolver. We're both licensed and know how to use them. But somehow, having those weapons didn't make me feel any safer. Eventually, biology won out over fear. We had to go, and we decided to go together. Safety in numbers, right? We turned on our flashlights and grabbed our guns. I tried to get Rex to come to the tent door, but he wouldn't budge. Pippin was still hidden under Zoe's sleeping bag. We had to physically drag them toward the tent entrance, which was disturbing in itself. These dogs follow commands perfectly, especially Rex. I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible, wincing at every tiny sound the zipper made. The dogs wouldn't go first. We actually had to push them out, which was so unlike them it made my stomach turn. They stayed right at our feet, pressing against our legs. Outside, the darkness felt suffocating. Our flashlight beams seemed dimmer than usual, barely cutting through the black void around us. The clearing that had seemed so peaceful during the day now felt exposed and threatening. The surrounding trees created a wall of darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from just beyond the reach of our lights. We walked about 20 yards from the tent to a spot we'd used before. The dogs stuck to us like glue, constantly looking around, tails tucked between their legs. Rex kept staring at one particular spot in the tree line, his body rigid. I followed his gaze but couldn't see anything. As we were finishing up, I heard that sound again, the whooping followed by the guttural noise. It seemed closer now, maybe 100 yards away. Zoe grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises, I discovered the next day. "What the fuck is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's get back to the tent." We hurried back, the dogs practically under our feet. I kept my flashlight pointed at the spot Rex had been watching, but never saw anything. No eye shine, no movement, nothing. Back in the tent, we zipped it up and just sat there, guns in our laps, flashlights on. Neither of us suggested turning them off. The dogs huddled between us, still trembling. We stayed that way until dawn broke around 6:30 a.m. As soon as there was enough light, we packed up camp in record time. We didn't even make coffee or breakfast, just stuffed everything into our packs and got the hell out of there. The dogs seemed eager to leave too, pulling at their leashes for the first time that trip. On the hike back to the car, we kept looking over our shoulders. The forest seemed normal again, birds singing, squirrels chattering, but it felt like a facade, like the woods were just pretending everything was fine. For weeks afterward, neither of us mentioned that night. I think we were both afraid the other would say we imagined it or were just scared of normal forest noises. When we finally talked about it over drinks about a month later, I was shocked to hear Zoe describe the exact same feeling I'd had, like something intelligent and dangerous had been watching us, stalking us. She told me she'd felt physically ill with dread that night, like her body was warning her of danger her eyes couldn't see. I'd felt the same way, a primal fear response that went beyond normal caution. We've analyzed it 100 times since then. Could it have been a bear? Maybe. But bears don't make those sounds, and they usually make noise moving through brush. Could it have been other hikers messing with us? Possibly, but we were miles from any trail, and who would follow two armed women just to scare them? A mountain lion? They don't touch tents with finger-like appendages. The only explanation that fits everything, the sounds, the touch on the tent, the dog's behavior, the overwhelming sense of dread, isn't one either of us is comfortable saying out loud. Zoe's mentioned Bigfoot a few times, but always with a nervous laugh afterward. I'm not sure what I believe, but I know what I felt. I've been camping since I was 8 years old. I've encountered bears, been caught in dangerous storms, even had a run-in with a pack of coyotes once. Nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever scared me like whatever was outside our tent that night in the Arkansas mountains. We've never gone back to that area. We still camp and hike, but always in more populated areas now. And we always bring the dogs, guns, and extra flashlights. Pippin eventually went back to his fearless self, but Rex still gets anxious at night sometimes, staring into the darkness at things I can't see. I still wake up sometimes at exactly 3:17 a.m., heart racing, convinced I've heard that strange call again. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the house at night, I swear I feel fingers lightly brushing against the walls, just like they did on our tent that night. Story 9. I still can't believe what happened that day on the river. It's been 3 months, and I haven't gone canoeing since. I haven't even wanted to. My friends think I'm being dramatic, but they weren't there. Well, not on the right fork anyway. It was supposed to be a normal end-of-semester trip with my university outdoor club. Nothing fancy, just a day trip down the Manistee River in northern Michigan. I'd done this route twice before and always loved it. The weather was perfect that day, warm but not hot. Maybe 75 degrees with a light breeze, the kind of late spring day that makes you glad to be alive. There were 10 of us total, paired up in 5 canoes. Me, Ethan, Jessica, Kyle, Amber, Marcus, Tara, Ben, Liz, Dylan, and Chris. We'd all done this trip before, except for Liz and Chris, who were new to the club. We put in around 11 in the morning, planning to be off the water by 5 at the latest. Everything was going great for the first hour or so. The water was running a little high from the spring rains, which made for a faster trip than usual. We were all just enjoying being away from campus. Finals were over, and summer was ahead of us. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, the sound of paddles dipping in the water, birds singing, the occasional splash of a fish. God, I wish we just kept going straight. Around 1 o'clock, we reached the split in the river. If you know the Manistee, you might know this spot. There's a fork where the river splits into 2 branches that rejoin about 1.5 miles downstream. The left fork follows along a dirt road for a while. It's wider and slightly slower. The right fork is narrower and cuts through a densely wooded area with no road access. Both paths meet up eventually at a wider section near an old bridge. Kyle, who was kind of the unofficial leader of our group, suggested we split up and race to the meeting point. It seemed like a fun idea at the time. 3 canoes, Kyle and Amber, Marcus and Tara, and Ben and Liz, took the left fork. That left me and Jessica in one canoe and Dylan and Chris in the other to take the right fork. The moment we rounded the bend into the right fork, the atmosphere changed. I can't explain it exactly, but it was like crossing some invisible boundary. The air felt heavier, damper somehow, and then the smell hit us. At first, it was just faint, like roadkill you pass on the highway, but it quickly grew stronger. It was this awful, rotting odor, like meat left in the sun for days, mixed with something else I couldn't identify, something musty and old. "What the hell is that smell?" Jessica asked from the back of our canoe. She pulled her shirt up over her nose. Dylan, in the canoe behind us, gagged audibly. Maybe a deer died near the water. That made sense, so we kept going. The right fork was narrower than I remembered, with trees hanging low over the water in places. The current was faster too, which should have been fun, but something felt off. The birds had gone quiet. I didn't notice it right away, but after a few minutes, the absence of sound became obvious. Just the splashing of our paddles and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. About 15 minutes in, we decided to pull over for a quick break. The smell was getting to Jessica, and honestly, to all of us. We found a small clearing on the right bank and beached the canoes. Chris had some hand sanitizer that we put under our noses to mask the stench. That's when Jessica froze, staring across the river. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" I asked, following her gaze. "Something moved between those trees over there." She pointed to a dense patch of forest on the opposite bank, maybe 30 yards away. We all looked, but I didn't see anything. "Probably just a deer," I said, though I wasn't convinced. The woods were too quiet for deer to be active. "It was big, too big for a deer," Jessica insisted, "and it was dark, like really dark." We stood there for a minute, all 4 of us scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. Chris laughed nervously and suggested we get back on the water. "We're falling behind in the race," he said, clearly trying to lighten the mood. As we pushed off, I glanced back at that spot one more time. Still nothing visible, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. The next stretch of river curved gently through thicker woods. The smell was getting worse, not better. It was so strong now that my eyes were watering. We picked up our pace, all of us eager to get to the meeting point and out of this increasingly creepy section of river. That's when Jessica suddenly stopped paddling. I felt our canoe slow and turned around to see her face had gone completely white. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling, "look to the right, but don't make it obvious." I casually turned my head as if scanning the shoreline. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just trees, undergrowth, shadows. Then I saw it. Partially hidden behind a large oak about 20 yards from the water's edge stood something. It was tall, taller than any person I've ever seen, 7 feet at least, maybe more. and unnaturally thin. Its body was dark, not like African American dark, but like shadow dark, like it was absorbing the light around it. I couldn't make out any features from that distance, just this impossibly tall black silhouette standing perfectly still among the trees. "Do you see it?" Jessica whispered. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my paddle. Behind us, I heard Dylan whisper something to Chris. "Let's go," I finally managed to say. "Just keep paddling, don't look at it." We increased our speed, trying not to seem panicked. I risked another glance toward the shore, and my blood went cold. It was still there, but it had moved. It was keeping pace with us, staying partially hidden behind trees, but definitely following alongside our canoes. "It's following us," Jessica hissed. "I know, just keep paddling." Dylan and Chris had seen it too. Their canoe pulled up alongside ours, and Chris's face was ashen. "What the fuck is that thing?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know. Just keep going," I replied. We were approaching a bend in the river. The thing in the woods was still pacing us, moving from tree to tree with an unnatural fluidity. It never fully exposed itself, always keeping partially hidden, but there was no doubt it was tracking us. As we neared the bend, something changed. The creature suddenly broke into a sprint, crashing through the underbrush. It moved with incredible speed, branches and foliage snapping as it tore through the forest. "It's running!" Dylan shouted, abandoning any pretense of calm. We paddled frantically, rounding the bend as fast as we could. A few seconds later, we heard a loud splash from somewhere ahead of us. "It's in the water!" Jessica cried, her voice cracking with fear. We slowed, not wanting to rush blindly forward. The river widened slightly after the bend, with a small sandy area on the far bank. As we cautiously proceeded, I saw it. The creature was pulling itself onto the opposite shore, water streaming from its dark form. It had somehow crossed through dense forest and swam across the river in less than a minute, covering what must have been over 200 yards. It moved differently now, more deliberately, like it was no longer concerned about being seen. As it climbed up the bank, I caught a better glimpse of it. The body was humanoid, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off, the limbs too long, too thin. It moved with a jerky, uneven gait that made my skin crawl. We drifted forward, all of us too shocked to speak. The smell was overwhelming now, so strong I could taste it in the back of my throat. A putrid, rotting stench that seemed to emanate from the creature itself. It disappeared into the trees on the far bank, and for a moment I thought maybe we'd lost it. We picked up speed again, desperate to reach the meeting point where our friends would be waiting. About a quarter-mile further downstream, the woods on the left bank gave way to a small clearing. And there it was, again. This time, it was moving slowly, almost casually, across the open space. Its dark silhouette was unmistakable against the green grass and fading afternoon light. It took heavy, deliberate strides, its impossibly long arms swinging at its sides. It was as if it wanted us to see it clearly now, to know exactly what was following us. "Oh my God," Jessica whispered, her voice so quiet I barely heard it. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned toward us. Even from that distance, maybe 50 yards, I could feel it watching us. I couldn't make out any features of its face, just a darker shadow where a head should be. It stood there, completely still, as we paddled past. None of us spoke. We just paddled harder than I've ever paddled in my life. My arms burned, my shoulders ached, but pure fear kept me going. The only sounds were our breathing and the frantic splashing of our paddles. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the river widened, and we saw the old bridge ahead. The other canoes were already there, our friends lounging on the banks, laughing and talking. As we approached them, I noticed two things simultaneously. The horrible smell was gone, and the oppressive feeling that had followed us down the river had lifted. It was like crossing back over that invisible boundary. Kyle noticed us first. "Well, Look who finally showed up. We've been waiting for like 20 minutes. None of us responded. We just beached the canoes and collapsed on the shore, exhausted and still terrified. What's wrong with you guys? Amber asked, her smile fading as she took in our expressions. Jessica was the first to speak. There was something in the woods, following us, watching us. The others exchanged glances. Marcus laughed. What, like a bear? No, I said firmly. Not a bear. It was, I don't know what it was. It was tall, like impossibly tall, and fast, and it smelled like death. They didn't believe us, of course. Kyle suggested we'd seen a moose, though moose are rare in that part of Michigan. Tara thought maybe it was just another hiker walking parallel to the river. Ben joked that we'd encountered the Michigan dogman, but they hadn't seen it. They hadn't felt that heavy, wrong feeling in the air. They hadn't smelled that horrific stench or seen how unnaturally that thing moved. We finished the trip before dark, paddling the last stretch in record time. None of us, me, Jessica, Dylan, or Chris, wanted to be on the water any longer than necessary. When we reached the takeout point, we packed up quickly and headed back to campus. The four of us have talked about it since then, trying to make sense of what we saw. Chris thinks it might have been some kind of undiscovered animal. Dylan wonders if it was a person playing a sick joke, though he can't explain how anyone could move that fast through dense forest. Jessica refuses to discuss it at all anymore. As for me, I still don't know. I can't explain what we encountered that day. All I know is that I'll never take the right fork of that river again. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, the taste of that rotting smell in the back of my throat, remembering how that thing stood at the edge of the clearing, watching us like it was letting us go. This time. Story 10. I still wake up in cold sweats sometimes. Even after all these years, that sound lives in my head. I've been hunting the dense forests around Mount Howard in northeast Oregon since I was 14, and nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened in those woods back in 2006. I'm Jacob, a lifelong hunter who grew up tracking and field dressing since before I could drive. That fall, I'd organized what was supposed to be our annual elk hunting trip with my buddy Brad Thompson and 4 friends, Steve and Miles Carson, along with their wives Jermaine and Cherry. Steve was our most experienced guy, a bear hunter who'd tracked predators across 3 states and knew animal behavior better than anyone I'd ever met. We'd set up camp about 3 miles south of Hurricane Creek trailhead outside Joseph. If you know the area, it's beautiful, but rugged as hell. Thick pines, steep ravines, and the kind of isolation that makes you feel like the last people on Earth sometimes. The first day had gone well. We spotted some promising elk tracks and set up our hunting zones for the next morning. It happened around 2 in the afternoon. On our second day out, Brad and I were working a ridge about half a mile from the others. The weather was perfect. Crisp, but not too cold, maybe 45 degrees, with barely any wind. I remember checking my rangefinder on a clearing ahead when we heard it. The sound started as something like a high-pitched whine, but then stretched into this drawn-out scream that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It was loud, so damn loud, but what really got to me wasn't the volume, but how wrong it sounded. Like a rusty metal gate being dragged open, but with this power behind it. This depth that no gate could make. And it lasted way too long, maybe 15 seconds of this continuous wail that seemed to bounce between the trees. Brad looked at me, and I looked at him. "Wind through the rocks," he said, but his face didn't match his words. I nodded, trying to convince myself, but something in my gut knew better. "Yeah, probably," I said, adjusting my rifle strap. "Let's keep moving." We hunted for another 2 hours, deliberately not talking about what we'd heard. When we got back to camp that evening, I was ready to forget the whole thing until Steve brought it up during dinner. "You guys hear anything strange today?" he asked, poking at the campfire with a stick. His face looked weird in the firelight, tense around the eyes. Brad and I exchanged looks. "Like what?" I asked. "Some kind of scream," Miles chimed in. "We were down by that creek with the fallen birch, and this sound came through the trees. Never heard anything like it." My stomach dropped. "What time was this?" "Little after 2, Cherry said quietly. She was sitting close to Miles, closer than usual. We all heard it. Sounded like it was maybe a quarter-mile away. That's when Steve spoke up, and I'll never forget the look on his face. Steve was 6'3", built like a linebacker, and had once faced down a charging black bear with nothing but his hunting knife when his rifle jammed. The man didn't scare, ever. "Whatever made that sound isn't something I want to meet," he said flatly. "After we heard it, we packed up and headed straight back using the main game trail. Didn't even try to be quiet about it." "Did you see anything?" Brad asked. Jermaine shook her head. "No, but it felt like something was watching us the whole way back." I tried to rationalize it. "Could have been a mountain lion. They can make some weird sounds." Steve looked at me hard. "Jacob, I've hunted cougar from here to Montana. That wasn't a cat. It wasn't an elk. It wasn't a moose. It wasn't a bear." "Then what was it?" I asked, immediately regretting the question. Nobody answered. We all just stared at the fire. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound kept replaying in my head, and with each mental replay, it seemed to get more unnatural, more wrong. Our tent was about 20 yards from the others, and I swear I could hear Brad breathing faster than normal too. Neither of us mentioned it again, but we both knew. The next morning, we changed our hunting plan. Nobody wanted to split up as much, and we stayed on established trails. The trip ended 2 days later without incident, but also without a single elk. Nobody complained about going home early. I tried to forget about it. For a while, I convinced myself it was just one of those weird forest acoustics, sound bouncing off rock faces or something. But 3 years later, in 2009, I was back in the same area with Miles. Just the two of us that time, bow hunting. It was early October, perfect weather again. We'd split up about 100 yards apart, but kept in whistle contact. I was set up near a small clearing, doing a cow call every 15 minutes or so to try and lure in a bull. After my third call, I heard something. Not the sound from before, but movement. Heavy, deliberate movement through the underbrush to my left. My first thought was, finally, an elk. But something felt off immediately. Elk move differently. They have a rhythm. This was slow, then fast, then slow again. Purposeful. Whatever it was, stopped just before breaking through the tree line into my sight. I'm not exaggerating when I say the forest went completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just dead air and the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I sat frozen for 20 minutes, arrow nocked, waiting for something to appear. Nothing ever did. But the feeling of being watched was so intense, I actually found myself sweating despite the cool air. Eventually, I whistled for Miles, and we decided to move to a different spot. I didn't tell him why. The strangest part came just last year, in 2022. Miles, Cherry, and I were having beers at their place, reminiscing about old hunting trips. Some Bigfoot documentary was playing in the background, one of those Finding Sasquatch shows I usually make fun of. I wasn't paying attention until Cherry suddenly went rigid on the couch. "Turn it up," she said, staring at the TV. They were playing some audio, recording supposedly of a Sasquatch call from Washington State. The sound that came through the speakers made my blood run cold. It wasn't identical to what we'd heard, but damn close. That same mechanical yet organic quality, the same sustained wail that shouldn't come from any living thing. "That's it," Cherry whispered. "That's the sound we heard. By your dad's property," she added, looking at Miles. Miles nodded slowly. "Always weird shit happening out there. Remember how my dad used to talk about seeing things crossing the road at dawn, or that smell?" I did remember. Miles's dad owned 80 acres adjacent to national forest land. and he'd mentioned a few strange experiences over the years. Rank smells that would appear and disappear in the thick brush, wood knocks in the distance, even a howl once that he'd attributed to wolves that aren't supposed to be here. The thing is, that area has changed a lot in the past decade. Logging has opened up much of it, and there are more hunters and hikers than ever before. Back in 2006, though, those forests were different. Darker, more tangled, more hidden. I'm a rational person. I believe in what I can see and touch. But that sound, and whatever was moving toward me that day in the clearing, has stuck with me in a way nothing else has. When I asked Steve about it years later, he just shook his head and said, "Some things in those woods are better left alone." Coming from a guy who tracked predators for fun, that said everything. Here's what I know for certain. In all my years hunting, I've never heard that sound again. I've been back to Mount Howard plenty of times since then, but I don't hunt alone anymore, and I sure as hell don't hunt in that specific area. Some places in the wilderness feel wrong in a way that's hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it. I still can't explain what happened out there. Maybe it was some bizarre acoustic phenomenon. Maybe it was some undocumented animal. All I know is that sound didn't belong in our world, and whatever made it knew we were there. Most nights, I can convince myself it was nothing. But sometimes, when I'm half asleep and the house is quiet, I swear I can hear it again. That drawn-out mechanical scream echoing through the trees, and I know something was watching us from the darkness between the pines. I've told this story maybe 3 times in my life. Most people think I'm exaggerating or making it up entirely. But Steve knows, Miles knows, and if you've ever felt that sensation of being watched in the deep woods, that primal gut-level certainty that you're not alone, maybe you know too. Story 11. I've been debating whether to post this for years now. I'm not looking for validation or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest because it's been eating at me for too long. I'm a rational person, been hunting in Michigan's forests since I was 12. I know what bears look like. I know what a man in a ghillie suit looks like. This wasn't either of those things. This happened during grouse season back in 2017. I'd taken a week off work for my annual hunting trip like I'd done for the past 20-something years. Nothing special about the day. Overcast, around 50 degrees, typical early October weather in northern Michigan. I was hunting solo that day in a section of lowland cedar swamp that borders the eastern edge of Huron National Forest, maybe 5 miles east of Glennie. It's remote, but not uncharted territory. I'd been through parts of it before, though I was exploring a new trail that morning. I'd parked my truck at a 2-track access point around 7:30 that morning and had been walking for about 2 hours. The hunting had been decent. I'd bagged 2 grouse already and was just enjoying the quiet. That's one thing about hunting a lot of people don't get. It's not always about the kill. Sometimes it's just about being out there, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. The trail I was following wasn't much of a trail at all, just a slightly worn path through the cedars, probably used by deer more than people. The ground was spongy with moss and old needles, and visibility was limited to maybe 40-50 yards at most because of how thick the trees were. I had my 12-gauge Remington over my shoulder. Not even at the ready, since I wasn't expecting to flush any birds in that particular stretch. That's when I smelled it. God, that smell. I've smelled plenty of dead things in my life. Roadkill, gut piles during deer season, even found a dead bear once that had been there for days. This was different. It was like rotting meat, but with this weird, musky undertone that made my stomach turn. It was so strong and sudden that I actually stopped walking and looked around, thinking I must be standing near something dead. I remember checking my watch. It was just after 9:30. I remember because I was thinking about whether I wanted to circle back toward the truck for lunch soon or keep pushing further in. Funny the details that stick with you. As I was standing there trying to figure out where that smell was coming from, I noticed something about 40 yards ahead on the trail. There was a tangle of fallen cedars, a blowdown from some previous storm, and behind it I could see something dark. At first I thought it was maybe a bear digging around in the deadfall, which isn't uncommon. Bears love to tear apart old logs looking for grubs. But something felt off. The shape wasn't quite right for a bear, and it wasn't moving like one either. It was sort of crouched down, but not on all fours exactly. I slowly brought my shotgun down from my shoulder, not raising it to aim, but just holding it at the ready. I didn't feel threatened yet, just confused. I stood completely still, watching. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, whatever it was must have sensed me there. It stood up. I'll never forget this as long as I live. This thing rose up from behind that blowdown, unfurling to its full height smoothly, almost gracefully. Not the way a bear stands on its hind legs, all awkward and wobbly. This thing just rose, and it kept rising. It was covered in dark brown hair, almost black in the shadowy forest light. Not fur exactly, more like long hair that hung in patches. Even from that distance, I could see the muscle definition across its back and shoulders as it stood up. The shoulders had to be at least 4 feet wide, broader than any human I've ever seen, and I used to work construction with some big guys. Then it turned its head. Not its whole body, just its head, like it was looking over its shoulder at me. I'm not a religious man, but in that moment, I prayed. Because when it turned and I saw its face, or what I could make out of its face from that distance, everything in me just froze. I couldn't have raised my gun if I'd wanted to. It was like my brain just shut down everything except the ability to stand there and stare. We locked eyes for what was probably only a couple seconds, but felt like minutes. Its eyes reflected the dim light, not like a deer's or cat's, but they caught the light somehow. I couldn't make out much detail of the face at that distance, just that it had a massive brow ridge and what looked like a flattish nose. Then, as calmly as anything, it just walked away. Didn't run, didn't charge, didn't make any threatening moves. Just turned and walked with these long, steady strides away from the trail, heading toward a small rise that led to an old clear-cut area that had grown up with young poplar trees. I remember thinking how confidently it moved, like it knew exactly where it was going and wasn't concerned about me at all. It wasn't crashing through the underbrush either. It moved quietly for something so big. As it crested that small hill and walked through the poplar saplings, that's when the scale of this thing really hit me. Those trees were a good 6 feet tall, and this thing's head and shoulders cleared them easily. I'm estimating it was at least 9 feet tall, maybe more, and then it was gone, disappearing into thicker woods beyond the clear cut. I stood there for I don't know how long. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I kept my shotgun ready, but there was this weird sense that I wasn't in danger. If that thing had wanted to hurt me, it could have. It knew I was there, and it just left. Eventually, I backtracked. Didn't run, but I moved quickly and deliberately back the way I'd come. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see it following me, but there was nothing, just empty trail and silence. That smell lingered for a while, though, fading as I got further away. When I got back to my truck, I sat there for a long time with the doors locked, trying to process what I'd seen. I didn't tell anyone at first. What was I supposed to say? Hey, I saw Bigfoot while I was hunting. I'd have sounded insane, so I just kept it to myself, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear with mange. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion caused by shadows and deadfall. Maybe I'd momentarily hallucinated from carbon monoxide leaking from my truck before the hunt, though I knew that was stretching it. But deep down, I knew what I saw. It wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal either. I finished out my hunting trip that year, but I stayed away from that part of the forest, kept to the more traveled areas, the spots where other hunters go. I told myself I was being stupid, that I'd seen something ordinary and just misinterpreted it in the moment. For almost 5 years, I didn't go back to that spot. I didn't talk about it either, except once when I was pretty drunk at deer camp and mentioned it to my buddy Mark, who predictably laughed it off and said I must have seen Swamp Ape's cousin, and we should sell the story to those Bigfoot hunter TV shows. After that, I kept my mouth shut. Then last year, I finally decided to go back. Partly because I was tired of avoiding some of the best grouse hunting areas, and partly because I needed to know if what I saw was real or if my mind had just played tricks on me. This time, I brought my brother Paul with me. I didn't tell him what I'd seen before, just said I knew a good spot for grouse that I hadn't hunted in a few years. We brought our dogs too, my black lab, Ruger, and Paul's Rottweiler, Gunner. Both dogs are experienced hunting companions, steady and reliable. Ruger has retrieved hundreds of birds for me and has never shown fear in the woods, except for the one time we encountered a mother bear with cubs. We parked at the same access point and started down the same trail. I was tense from the moment we entered the woods, but I tried not to show it. Paul was chatting about work and his kids, and I was giving him one-word answers, my eyes scanning the trees ahead. The dogs were out in front of us, quartering back and forth like they always do when hunting. We'd gone maybe half a mile down the trail, not even close to where I'd had my encounter, when both dogs suddenly stopped. Ruger came trotting back to me with his tail tucked, which is completely out of character for him. Gunner, who's normally fearless to the point of stupidity, stopped dead in his tracks about 20 yards ahead of us on the trail. Both dogs were staring ahead, their ears perked up, bodies rigid. Gunner started this low growl that I could barely hear, and Ruger pressed against my legs, whining softly. "What's up with the dogs?" Paul asked. I didn't answer. I was feeling it again, that same uneasiness I'd felt 5 years before. There was no smell this time, at least not that I could detect, but something felt wrong. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Gunner suddenly turned and trotted back to Paul, tail down, looking over his shoulder repeatedly. When Paul tried to urge him forward again, both dogs flat out refused. Ruger actually sat down and wouldn't budge, still staring ahead and whining. "Something's got them spooked," Paul said, looking around. "Bear, maybe." I shook my head. These dogs have seen bears before. This is different. I didn't elaborate, but in that moment, I knew. Whatever I'd seen 5 years ago was still out there, somewhere ahead on that trail. And the dogs sensed it even if we couldn't see it. We stood there for maybe 5 minutes, trying to coax the dogs forward, but it was useless. These weren't pets. They were working hunting dogs that normally lived to push ahead through the woods, but something had them terrified. Finally, I said, "Let's head back." Paul looked at me like I was crazy. We'd only been out for about 10 minutes and hadn't even fired a shot. But he must have seen something in my face because he didn't argue. As we turned to leave, I swear I felt eyes on my back. I didn't look. I didn't want to see it again. We walked quickly back to the truck, the dogs practically pulling us along, eager to get away. Only when we were back at the truck did Paul ask, "What the hell was that about? I've never seen Gunner act like that." I almost told him then, almost spilled the whole story, but I just said, "I don't know. Something wasn't right back there." We hunted other areas that day and had decent luck. The dogs went back to normal as soon as we were away from that trail. But I knew then that I'd never go back to that stretch of forest again. Whatever that thing was I saw 5 years ago, it's still there. Still patrolling that same territory. I don't know what it was. I don't want to put a name to it. All I know is that it exists, and it lives in those woods, and both times I've been in its territory, I've had the distinct feeling that it was allowing me to leave. Story 12. I've been sitting on this story for over 40 years now. My dad, Vernon, made me swear never to talk about what we saw that morning at Caddo Lake, but he's been gone 12 years now, and I guess some stories just need to be told. I'm 61 years old, and what I saw when I was 20 still gives me chills when I think about it. It was early May 1979. I had just finished my sophomore year at Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches and had come home to Panola County for the summer. Dad had been asking me to go fishing with him for weeks. He was always an early riser, especially for fishing trips, so when he knocked on my bedroom door at 4:30 that morning, I wasn't surprised. "James, you up? Water's gonna be perfect this morning," he said through the door. I remember groaning but getting up anyway. Dad had this way of making you feel guilty if you didn't join him, even though he never actually said anything. It was just this look he'd give you, like you were missing out on something important. The drive to Caddo Lake was quiet. Dad was never much of a talker, especially that early in the morning. He had his thermos of black coffee, and I was still trying to wake up. The sky was just starting to lighten, that deep blue before the sun actually rises. We had the windows down, and I remember the smell of the pines and that damp, earthy smell you only get near lakes and swamps. Dad's old Ford pickup rattled down the dirt roads. He knew every turn like the back of his hand. We weren't going to any of the usual spots where other fishermen might show up. Dad always said the best fishing was where other people weren't, and he knew places on Caddo Lake that I swear no one else had ever been to. We got to this little clearing where you could barely see the water through the cypress trees. Their knees were sticking up all around the shoreline, and Spanish moss hung down, creating this curtain that seemed to separate the lake from the rest of the world. Dad had his old John boat turned upside down, hidden under some brush. This was his secret spot, and he'd been coming here for as long as I could remember. We flipped the boat over and dragged it to the water. It wasn't much to look at, just a flat-bottomed aluminum boat that had seen better days, with 2 wooden seats and a pile of life jackets that had faded from orange to almost pink. But it was stable and quiet, which was what mattered for fishing. Dad handed me 2 cane poles while he grabbed the tackle box and a small cooler with some sandwiches and Dr. Peppers. We didn't use fancy rods and reels. Dad believed in fishing the old way, with cane poles, bobbers, and live bait. We had a coffee can full of worms we'd dug up the night before. The water was like glass that morning, with wisps of fog hovering just above the surface. It was so quiet you could hear water droplets falling from the paddle when Dad lifted it. The cypress trees created these dark tunnels of water we could navigate through, and that's where we were headed, to the back part of the lake where the big crappie and bass liked to hide. I was sitting in the front of the boat, facing Dad as he paddled. He was being extra careful not to make noise, just gently moving the paddle in a figure-8 motion without lifting it out of the water. The boat glided silently through the water. We'd been out for maybe an hour, and the sun was just starting to filter through the trees. We'd caught a few small crappie, nothing to brag about, but it was peaceful. That's when everything changed. I noticed Dad's face first. We were floating near the edge of this little cove where the water met the shoreline under a canopy of trees. I was baiting my hook when I glanced up and saw Dad had gone completely white. I mean like chalk white. His eyes were wide open, fixed on something behind me, and his hands had stopped mid-motion on the paddle. I remember asking, "What is it?" in a whisper, but he didn't answer. He just raised one trembling hand and pointed past my shoulder toward the bank. I turned around slowly, trying not to rock the boat. At first, I thought it was a black bear. About 15 feet from the water's edge, there was what looked like a large black figure hunched over a fallen log. It was digging through the leaves and debris on the forest floor, its back to us. "Bear?" I whispered, turning back to Dad for confirmation. That's when it happened. As soon as I spoke, even though it was barely audible, the figure stopped moving. Then it turned its head, not its whole body, just its head, toward us. I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. The way it moved wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It was deliberate, almost human-like. When it fully turned to face us, I could see it wasn't a bear. The face was wrong. It was dark, with features I couldn't quite make out in the shadows, but I could feel it looking directly at us. Then it stood up. It rose up on 2 legs and kept rising until it was easily 7 feet tall. It was covered in dark hair or fur, but stood perfectly upright like a man. Its arms hung down at its sides, longer than they should have been. It just stood there for maybe 5 seconds, staring at us, and I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Then it turned and walked away. Not on all fours like a bear would, but upright, on 2 legs, striding quickly between the trees. It moved with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the darkness of the forest. I turned back to Dad, my mouth open to say something, but the look on his face stopped me. I'd never seen my father scared before that day. He was always the toughest man I knew, a Vietnam vet who'd worked in the oil fields and could handle anything. But in that moment, he looked terrified. Without a word, he started paddling, not the careful, quiet paddling from before, but hard, desperate strokes that splashed water and rocked the boat. He didn't care about noise anymore. He just wanted to get away from that place as fast as possible. "Dad, what was that?" I asked when I finally found my voice. "Just keep your eyes open," he said, not stopping his frantic paddling. "Make sure it's not following us." I kept looking behind us, half expecting to see that figure walking across the water after our boat. The peaceful morning was gone. Every shadow among the trees now looked threatening, and every sound made me jump. A blue heron took off from nearby, and I nearly fell out of the boat. We made it back to our launch point in record time. Dad beached the boat hard, scraping the bottom on the shore, and jumped out. We grabbed our gear and flipped the boat over faster than I'd ever seen, not even bothering to clean the fish we'd caught. Dad threw everything in the back of the truck, and we were driving away within minutes. The ride home was dead silent for the first 20 minutes. Dad's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and he kept checking the rearview mirror. Finally, when we were on the main highway heading back to Carthage, he spoke. "James, what we saw back there, that wasn't a bear." "I know," I said. "What was it?" He didn't answer right away. He pulled over to the side of the road and turned off the engine. Then he lit a cigarette with shaking hands, something I rarely saw him do that early in the day. "My daddy told me about it when I was about 12, he finally said. His daddy told him, and so on, going back to when our family first settled in these parts. We don't talk about it outside the family." "Talk about what?" I asked. "The booger," he said, using the old local term I'd heard whispered by my grandparents. "That's what my granddaddy called it. Others have different names." "Like what, Bigfoot?" I asked, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Dad's face hardened. "This isn't a joke, James. This isn't some tabloid nonsense. This is something that's been in these woods since before white men came here. The old folks said seeing it brings bad luck. Talking about it brings worse." He took a long drag from his cigarette. "My uncle Elmer saw it in 1942, right before he shipped out to the Pacific. He never came back. My cousin William saw it in 68, a week before his car went off the road by that same lake. There are other stories." I'd never heard any of this before. Dad's family had been in Panola County for generations, but this part of our family history had been kept from me. "So you're saying it's some kind of omen?" I asked. "I'm saying we don't talk about it," he said firmly. "Not to your mother, not to your friends, not to anyone. We forget it happened. You understand me?" The look in his eyes told me he was dead serious. I nodded, and we drove the rest of the way home in silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that figure standing up, turning to walk away. I kept thinking about how human-like it had seemed, but also how fundamentally wrong it had looked. Not just a man in a suit or a bear on its hind legs. Something else entirely. True to his word, Dad never mentioned that day again. Not once in all the years before he died. But I could tell it affected him. He never went fishing at Caddo Lake again, at least not to that spot. When friends would invite him, he'd make excuses, said his back was bothering him or he was too busy with work. I've honored his wish to keep quiet all these years. I've never told anyone, not even my wife. But I've done research on my own, read accounts from other parts of East Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Enough to know we weren't the only ones who've seen something in those woods. What bothers me most isn't just what we saw that day. It's the feeling I had when it looked at us, like it recognized us somehow, like it knew exactly who we were. I can't explain it, but I felt known by whatever that was. I still live in Panola County. I still drive past the roads leading to Caddo Lake, but I've never gone back to that part of the lake, and I never will. Some doors are better left closed, some secrets better kept. But after all these years, I needed to write this down, even if no one ever reads it. I don't know if Dad was right about the bad luck. Nothing terrible happened to me after that day. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods behind my house, I get the feeling I'm being watched. And on certain nights, when the wind is still and the moon is hidden, I hear something moving out there that doesn't move like any animal should. Story 13. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but it's haunted me for so long that maybe putting it out here will help me make sense of it. I've read other people's experiences, and some sound similar to mine, which gives me a bit of comfort knowing I'm not completely crazy. This happened back in December of '98. My family and I were living on this huge property, about 60 acres, mostly dense woods near Colville, Washington. It's pretty remote, which we loved because of the privacy, but after what happened, that isolation took on a different feeling altogether. It was late December, really cold that year. We'd had some snow earlier in the month, but it had mostly melted, leaving the ground partially frozen and muddy in patches. I remember because I had knee surgery a few weeks before, and I was still hobbling around with a cane, cursing every time I had to navigate the slippery parts of our yard. That night, I'll never forget it, it was around 10 o'clock. My wife and I were sitting in the living room watching some show. The kids were supposed to be in bed, but my oldest, Jake, who was 17 at the time, had asked to go out on the porch for a smoke. I didn't like him smoking, but teenagers, you know? Better he did it where I knew than sneaking around. The TV was playing, but I wasn't really paying attention. My knee was aching something fierce, and I was half dozing in my recliner when my wife suddenly grabbed my arm. I jerked awake, thinking maybe I'd been snoring or something, but her face was white as a sheet. "There's something at the window," she whispered, pointing toward the back of the house. At first, I thought she was seeing things. Our property backs up against the woods, and at night, the windows turn into mirrors unless you're right up against them. But she was insistent, so I turned to look. What I saw made my blood run cold. Two bright green eyes were staring into our house, not like a deer or coyote. Those I've seen plenty of times. These were huge, much bigger than any animal I'd ever encountered, and they were spaced unnaturally far apart. They glowed like they were catching the light from inside our house, but brighter than any normal reflection should be. Just as I was struggling to get up from my chair, the front door flew open and Jake burst in, white-faced and shaking. "Dad," he gasped, "there's something out there, by the garage." My wife made a small, frightened sound. Jake hadn't even been near the back window. Whatever he'd seen was something else, or the same thing had moved incredibly fast. I asked him what he saw, trying to keep my voice steady. He couldn't seem to find the words at first, just kept running his hands through his hair and looking back at the door like he expected something to come crashing through it. Finally, he managed to tell us that he'd gone out to light his cigarette and felt like something was watching him. He thought it was me checking up on him at first, but when he looked toward the detached garage about 30 feet from the house, he saw something peering around the corner. "It was huge, Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "It had this dark, long hair hanging over its face. I couldn't really see features, but it was watching me. I know it was." I asked him, "How big exactly?" And he pointed to the basketball hoop mounted on our garage wall. "Its head was above the rim," he said, 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and it wasn't standing straight up. My wife was clutching my arm so tight it hurt, but I barely noticed. The back window where she'd seen the eyes was on the opposite side of the house from where Jake had seen this thing. Either there were two of them, or it had moved around our house faster than seemed possible. I'm not a man who scares easily. I've lived in rural areas most of my life and know how to handle myself. Despite my bad knee, I grabbed my shotgun from the cabinet and told my wife to get our younger kids into the master bedroom and lock the door. Jake wanted to come with me, but I ordered him to stay with his mother and siblings. The look of relief on his face told me he wasn't going to argue. I hobbled out onto the front porch, scanning the darkness. Our yard lights illuminated the immediate area around the house, but beyond that was pitch black. The garage was partially lit, and I could see the corner Jake had mentioned. Nothing was there now. The cold hit me immediately, making my knee throb worse. It was dead silent, no wind, no animals, not even the usual distant highway noise, just complete stillness, like the whole world was holding its breath. I made my way carefully down the porch steps, gun ready, straining to see or hear anything unusual. My instincts were screaming that something was still out there, watching from the darkness. I checked around the garage, keeping my back to the wall as best I could while dealing with my bum knee. Nothing. I shined my flashlight into the woods at the edge of our cleared area, but the beam only penetrated the first few yards of trees. After about 20 minutes of searching and finding nothing, the cold became too much for my knee, and I had to go back inside. My wife and kids were huddled in our bedroom, the younger ones confused and sleepy, Jake still, looking shaken. "Did you see it?" he asked immediately. I shook my head. Nothing moving out there now. None of us slept well that night. I kept getting up to check the windows, but nothing else happened. By morning, I almost wondered if we'd all just spooked ourselves somehow, but deep down, I knew better. After sunrise, while my wife was making breakfast, I decided to check around the property in daylight. My knee was stiff and swollen from the cold and stress the night before, but I couldn't rest until I'd looked around. Behind the garage was a patch of ground that was a mix of clay and sand. We'd had a small project back there earlier in the fall, and the ground hadn't fully recovered. As I approached it, something caught my eye, an impression in the dirt. It was a footprint, but not like any footprint I'd ever seen before. It was huge, easily 16 inches long and about 8 inches across at the widest part. The impression was deep at the heel, and the ball of the foot, showing whatever made it had substantial weight. But what really disturbed me were the toes. They were small compared to the massive foot, evenly spaced, 5 of them distinct in the softer part of the ground. It wasn't a bear track, I've seen plenty of those. Bears have 5 toes too, but they're arranged differently, and bear tracks have claw marks extending from the toes. This had no claw marks, and bears don't stand 7 to 8 feet tall and peer around corners. I took some measurements and photos, though the impression wasn't perfect because of the mixed soil. By the time I brought Jake out to see it, it had already started to deteriorate in the morning sun as the ground thawed. We searched for more tracks, but found nothing conclusive. Whatever it was had somehow avoided the muddier patches of our property, or was light-footed enough not to leave obvious impressions anywhere else. For weeks afterward, we were on edge. I installed more outdoor lights, and nobody went outside alone. After dark, we heard nothing, saw nothing. Life slowly returned to normal, though Jake asked to move his bedroom from the basement to the main floor, and none of us argued with that decision. Almost a year passed. I'd nearly convinced myself that we'd experienced something strange but explainable, maybe a particularly large bear with some kind of mange or skin condition that made it look different. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. Then, in November of '99, I was up late one night when my knee was bothering me again. Everyone else was asleep. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it, a howl unlike anything I've ever heard before or since. It came from the ridge behind our house, maybe half a mile into the woods. It started low, almost like a moan, then rose in pitch and volume until it seemed to fill the entire valley. It wasn't a coyote or wolf, I know those sounds well. It wasn't a cougar scream either. This was deeper, more resonant, like it came from something with a massive chest cavity. The sound carried through the night air in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. It echoed off the hills and seemed to go on forever. Then it stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. Then it came again, slightly farther away this time, like whatever made the sound was moving along the ridge. I didn't wake my family. What was the point? We couldn't do anything about it, and I didn't want to frighten them again. The next morning, I called a neighbor whose property adjoined our back acreage. He'd heard it too and had no explanation. He'd lived in the area for 30 years and said he'd never heard anything like it. I've noticed a pattern over the years. Both the sighting and the howling happened during cold months, late at night. We've never had another clear sighting, but sometimes, especially in winter, I get the feeling we're being watched from the woods. I've read about similar experiences since then. Some people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Others have different names for it. I don't know what to call what visited our property that night. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent enough to avoid leaving many traces, and it was interested in our home and family. We still live on the same property. My kids are grown now, but when they visit with their own families, nobody goes out alone after dark. We don't talk about it much anymore, but none of us has forgotten. Sometimes when I'm alone and look out at those woods, I wonder if it's still out there, watching and waiting for some reason I'll never understand. Story 14. I never believed in monsters. Growing up in Pinewood Hollow, Georgia, the scariest things I'd ever encountered were the occasional copperhead snake or maybe a particularly aggressive raccoon. That changed last summer, and I still haven't found a way to explain what's been happening at my property. I'm writing this because I don't know what else to do anymore. I've owned my dog kennel business for almost 7 years now. It's nothing fancy, just a modest breeding operation on 5 acres, surrounded by dense woods about 4 miles outside of town. I raise mostly Labradors and Golden Retrievers, occasionally some Beagles too. My house sits at the front of the property, and the kennels are about 50 yards behind it. I can see the entire kennel area from my upstairs bathroom window, which has been pretty convenient for nighttime checks. My routine has always been the same. Before bed, I'd peek out that window to make sure all was well with my dogs. I never turn the lights on during these checks. Learned that lesson years ago when all I could see was my own reflection in the glass. Better to let your eyes adjust to the darkness. The night it first appeared was unusually quiet. It was a Tuesday in late July, around 11:30 at night. My mom was staying with me for the week while my 2 kids were at their dad's place. I remember the crickets were going crazy that night, and there was this thick humidity hanging in the air that made everything feel heavy. I was getting ready for bed and went to the bathroom window for my usual check. At first, everything seemed normal. The kennels were quiet, which usually means everyone settled down for the night. Then I noticed something wasn't right. All 23 of my dogs were completely silent. Not a bark, not a whimper, nothing. Anyone who knows dogs understands how unnatural that is, especially when there's something unfamiliar nearby. That's when I saw it. Standing on the far side of the kennels was something. I froze, my hands gripping the windowsill so hard my knuckles turned white. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, maybe more. The shape was vaguely human, but wrong somehow. It was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur that hung from its body. The proportions were all off, arms too long, torso too wide. What hit me hardest was how still it was, just standing there, completely motionless, like it was surveying the kennels. My dogs, who go absolutely ballistic if a squirrel comes within 20 feet of the property, were dead silent. I could see them huddled in their houses, not a single one brave enough to come out. I watched, unable to move, as the thing took 3 slow, deliberate steps eastward. Its movement was fluid, but wrong. Like watching something that's learned how to mimic human walking, but doesn't quite get it right. Then it stopped and pivoted its entire body to face north, like it was listening for something. I don't know how long I stood there watching it. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe 5 minutes. Time felt meaningless. Finally, I managed to tear myself away from the window. I ran to my mom's room, nearly hyperventilating. "Mom!" I whispered urgently, shaking her awake. "Mom, there's something outside by the kennels." She must have seen the terror on my face, because she didn't question me. She just got up and followed me back to the bathroom. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. "There," I pointed with a shaking hand. "By the far pen. Do you see it?" She squinted, then I felt her stiffen beside me. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. We stood there together, watching this thing for about a minute. It hadn't moved again. Then, without any warning, it slowly turned and walked toward the woods. Its gait was strange, too smooth, almost gliding. It disappeared into the tree line, and I swear the crickets, which had gone silent, started chirping again the moment it was gone. "Was that a person?" Mom asked, her voice trembling. "Someone in a costume?" I shook my head. "No one around here is that tall. And did you see how the dogs were acting? They're terrified." We checked all the locks twice that night. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it had been some weird optical illusion or a shadow playing tricks. But the dogs were still acting strange. Nervous, huddled together, watching the woods. 3 nights later, it came back. This time, I was alone. The kids were still at their dad's, and Mom had gone back to her place. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it. A deep, rumbling sound from outside, not quite a growl, not quite anything I'd ever heard before. The bathroom window was cracked open, and the sound drifted in clear as day. My whole body went cold. I approached the window slowly, terrified of what I might see. It was standing in almost the exact same spot, but this time it was moving its head back and forth, scanning the kennels. The moonlight caught it better this time, and I could see more details. The way its shoulders hunched forward unnaturally, the strange, elongated shape of what must have been its head. Again, my dogs were silent, cowering. These are working dogs, bred for courage and loyalty. Some of my males weigh close to 90 pounds and wouldn't back down from a fight with anything. But whatever this thing was, it terrified them beyond their instinct to protect or defend. I didn't watch for long this time. I backed away from the window, went to my bedroom and locked the door. I called my mum, whispering even though I knew it couldn't possibly hear me from outside. "It's back," was all I could say. "Sarah, you need to call someone," she insisted. "The sheriff, animal control, someone." But what would I tell them? That there's a Bigfoot stalking my dog kennel? That some monster from a horror movie is terrorizing my property? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, they'd tell others in town. In a place like Pinewood Hollow, that kind of story would follow me forever. I'd be the crazy dog lady who sees monsters. The visits became more frequent after that. Sometimes I'd just hear it, moving through the brush at the edge of the property, branches breaking under its weight. Other times, it would stand in full view, always near the kennels, always watching. The worst was the screaming. The first time I heard it, I was sitting in the living room with my kids who had returned from their dads. It was around 9 at night, and we were watching a movie. The sound cut through everything. A high, keening wail that descended into something deeper and more guttural than any human could produce. It wasn't an animal sound either. Not a coyote or a fox or anything I've ever heard in these woods. My daughter, who's 9, started crying immediately. "What was that, Mom?" I lied. Told them it was probably just a fox or something. But my son, who's 12 and too smart for his own good, didn't buy it. "That wasn't a fox," he said quietly. "That sounded like a person. But it wasn't a person. No person could make that sound. The children began to notice other things too. They refused to go outside after dark. My son said he saw something watching him from the tree line while he was taking out the trash at dusk. My daughter began having nightmares about the tall man who isn't a man. I ordered motion sensor lights for the entire perimeter of the property. They helped a little. At least I could see if something triggered them. But they seemed to make the creature more cautious, not scared it away like I'd hoped. It would stay just at the edge of the light's reach or move between the blind spots. Last week, I woke up around 3 in the morning to find my daughter standing beside my bed, crying silently. "It's looking in my window, Mommy," she whispered. Her room is on the 2nd floor. I took her into my bed and held her until she fell asleep, telling myself she was just having nightmares. But in the morning, I found muddy prints outside the house, beneath her window. They were huge, easily twice the size of my foot, and oddly shaped. Not quite human, not quite animal. I'm writing this now because last night was the worst yet. My mom came to stay again after I called her in tears. We were sitting in the kitchen when the motion lights went off one by one, circling the house. Like it was pacing, testing the perimeter. Then the screaming started. Not one voice, but two. Two of these things, calling to each other across my property. One by the kennels, one closer to the house. The dogs were whimpering, pushing themselves against the backs of their houses. We huddled in the center of the house, my mum, my kids, and me. I've never felt so helpless. There's no man in the house. My ex lives 40 minutes away. I have a shotgun, but what good would it do against something that size? Something that might not even be natural. The screaming went on for almost 20 minutes. Then silence. When we checked the window, the motion lights were still on, but nothing was moving out there. This morning, I found all the water bowls in the kennel overturned, every single one. And something had opened the latch on one of the pens, a latch that's 6 feet off the ground and requires opposable thumbs to manipulate. The dog inside was unharmed, but trembling in the corner. I don't know what to do anymore. I can't sell this place. It's all I have. I can't afford to move my entire business. The police would think I'm crazy. My ex already thinks I'm making this up to scare the kids into wanting to stay with him instead. Whatever these things are, they're getting bolder. Coming closer to the house, testing the boundaries, watching us, and I think they know I'm watching them back. Story 15. I'm still trying to process what happened last November. I don't usually share personal stuff online, but I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. I've been hunting for over 20 years. Started when I was just a teenager with my dad, and I've hunted everything from whitetail in Michigan to elk in Colorado to kudu in South Africa. I'm not some amateur who gets spooked by every twig snap in the woods. I know animal sounds. I know what belongs in the forest and what doesn't. But what I heard in those Ohio woods last year, I can't explain it. And it changed everything I thought I knew. It was November 6th, 2013. I remember the date clearly because I'd been looking forward to this hunt for months. I'd secured permission to hunt on this private property in Medina County near Ray, Ohio. Beautiful piece of land, about 80 acres of mature pines with some oak ridges and a few small meadows. Perfect deer habitat. I arrived at the property around 2 in the afternoon. The weather was ideal, about 45 degrees, overcast, with just a slight breeze from the northwest, the kind of day deer move freely. I parked my truck at the edge of the property, grabbed my gear, and sprayed down with scent killer before heading in. I was wearing full camouflage, real tree pattern with a face mask and gloves. I had my compound bow, my rangefinder, and a small pack with water, some jerky, and basic supplies. Nothing unusual about my setup. The spot I wanted to hunt was about 3/4 of a mile in. I'd set up a deer feeder there about 2 weeks earlier, loaded with corn and apples. My trail cam had captured several nice bucks visiting it, including a 10-pointer I was hoping to get a shot at. I took my time walking in, being careful not to make noise. I reached my hunting spot around 3:30. It was a small clearing surrounded by mature pines with a slight depression in the middle where I'd placed the feeder. My tree stand was on the edge of the clearing, about 18 feet up a sturdy oak. I climbed up, secured my safety harness, and settled in for what I expected would be a routine evening hunt. For the next hour or so, everything was normal. A few squirrels scampered around. Some chickadees and nuthatches flitted through the pines. A couple of does with fawns came to the feeder around 4:30, fed for about 15 minutes, then wandered off. The sun was starting to get low, not quite setting yet, but that golden hour when the forest gets quiet and deer typically start moving more. I remember checking my watch. It was about 5:45. Still enough light to see clearly, but shadows were getting longer. That's when it happened. I heard it from what I estimated was less than 50 yards away, maybe from a dense stand of pines to the northeast of my position. The sound started low, almost like a moan, but quickly rose into something I can only describe as a screaming howl. It lasted maybe 5 to 10 seconds, and I felt it in my chest as much as heard it with my ears. It wasn't a coyote, it wasn't a bobcat. It definitely wasn't a deer or any other animal I've encountered in my years of hunting. The pitch was too deep to be a bird of prey. The volume was substantial. Whatever made that sound had serious lung capacity. My first thought was that it might be another hunter playing some kind of prank, but the sound wasn't human either. No human could make that noise without some kind of electronic amplification. And this sound had a raw, organic quality to it. The birds feeding nearby, there were about a half dozen small birds at the feeder, immediately took flight, all heading southwest, directly away from where the sound had originated. That's what really got to me. Animals know what belongs in their environment and what doesn't, and they were clearly spooked. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I was terrified. 20 years of hunting experience, encounters with bears, mountain lions, even an angry Cape buffalo in South Africa once, and nothing had ever made me feel the way I felt in that moment. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. My mouth went completely dry. I had this overwhelming urge to climb down and run, but some instinct told me to stay absolutely still. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, I didn't move a muscle. I barely breathed. I just listened. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. That unnatural silence was almost as unsettling as the scream had been. Then I heard it. Movement in the underbrush from the direction the sound had come from. Not the light steps of a deer or even the heavier tread of a black bear. This was something deliberately moving, breaking branches, pushing through vegetation. Whatever it was big, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. I slowly, carefully reached for my binoculars. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold them up to my eyes. I scanned the edge of the clearing where the sounds were coming from, but the light was fading, and the shadows under the pines were deep. That's when I caught a glimpse of something moving between two trees about 40 yards away. Just a dark shape, taller than a man, moving upright. I only saw it for a second before it disappeared behind a thick pine, but that was enough to send ice through my veins. The movement in the brush continued, circling around to my right, staying just inside the tree line. Whatever it was paralleling the edge of the clearing, like it was watching the feeder, or watching me. I considered taking out my phone to try to record what was happening, but I was afraid any movement might draw attention. So I just sat there, my bow across my lap, utterly useless against whatever was out there. After about 10 minutes of this movement around the perimeter, everything went quiet again. No more breaking branches, no more heavy footsteps. Just silence. I wondered if it had left, but something told me it was still there, watching. The light was really fading now. Legal shooting hours for deer were over, and I had a decision to make. Did I want to climb down in the growing darkness, knowing that thing might still be out there? Or did I want to wait and hope it moved on? I decided to wait until it was completely dark. I had a small headlamp in my pack, and I figured I'd use that to find my way back to the truck once I couldn't see without it. It was only about a 20-minute walk out if I moved quickly. As I sat there, the forest gradually came back to life. I heard an owl hoot in the distance. A few crickets started chirping. Whatever had disrupted the natural order seemed to have moved on, or at least wasn't being perceived as an immediate threat anymore. By 7:15, it was fully dark. I hadn't heard any unusual sounds for over an hour. I finally worked up the courage to climb down from my stand. My legs were so stiff from sitting tensely for so long that I nearly fell on the way down. Once on the ground, I switched on my headlamp, slung my bow over my shoulder, and started walking quickly toward my truck. I didn't run. Running in the dark through the woods is a good way to get hurt. But I moved as fast as I safely could. Every few steps, I'd stop and listen, shining my light in a full circle around me. Nothing seemed to be following me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I made it back to my truck without incident. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door. Once inside, I locked the doors, started the engine, and cranked the heater. I was suddenly aware of how cold I was, not from the temperature, but from fear. As I drove away from that property, I promised myself I wouldn't come back, at least not alone. I've hunted some remote wilderness areas all over North America and Africa, but I've never felt as vulnerable as I did that evening in Medina County. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying that scream in my head, trying to match it to any known animal. Nothing fit. I've heard coyotes, wolves, mountain lions, bears. Nothing comes close to what I heard. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I started researching unusual animal sounds in Ohio. That's when I stumbled across recordings of what people call the Ohio Grassman, or Bigfoot vocalizations. I was never a believer in that stuff, always thought it was just stories made up by people who'd had too much to drink around a campfire. But when I played one particular recording, my blood ran cold. It matched exactly what I'd heard that evening. The same pitch, the same duration, the same unnerving quality that seemed to be somewhere between animal and human, but neither. I'm not saying I saw Bigfoot. I can't be sure what I glimpsed moving through those trees, but I know what I heard, and I know it wasn't anything that's supposed to be in those woods. I haven't been back to that property since. The landowner has called a few times, asking why I haven't been out to hunt, but I've made excuses. I haven't told him what happened. I haven't told anyone until now. I was worried people would think I was crazy or that I'd had too much to drink before my hunt. I hadn't. I never drink when I'm hunting. I'm still hunting, but not alone, and not in Medina County. I go with a buddy now, even though I've been a solo hunter most of my life. Some nights I still wake up hearing that scream in my dreams. I don't know what's out there in those Ohio woods, but whatever it is, it changed me. I used to be a skeptic. Now I'm not so sure anymore. Story 16. I've been hesitating to write this down for years. Even now, almost 50 years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that winter night in 1973. I was 11 years old, living in Johnson County, Iowa, and what I experienced with my friends changed us forever. It was mid-January, bitterly cold but clear. The kind of night where the stars seem extra bright and the moon hangs low and full, casting everything in this eerie blue light. My parents owned a small farm on the outskirts of town, and my three best friends, Jessica, Laura, and Olivia, were staying over for the weekend. Jessica and Laura were both 11 like me, and Olivia was 15, which made her impossibly cool in our eyes. We'd been begging our parents to let us camp out for ages, even though it was winter. My dad finally caved, probably thinking we'd chicken out once we felt how cold it really was. He helped us set up this old canvas tent about 100 yards from the house, at the base of the hill where we always played. That hill was our kingdom. We spent nearly every day there when the weather was nice, building forts and playing make-believe games. Earlier that fall, we'd even constructed a small corral at the top of the hill, hammering 2x4 lumber into the trees to create a little enclosure for our imaginary horses. It wasn't much, just some scrap wood my dad had let us use, but we were so proud of it. The plan was to sleep in the tent that night, armed with flashlights, extra blankets, and thermoses of hot chocolate. My mum made us promise we'd come back to the house if we got too cold, and we eagerly agreed, though none of us planned to admit defeat. By 11 o'clock, we were all snuggled into our sleeping bags, giggling and telling ghost stories by flashlight. The farm was quiet, except for the occasional sound of the wind rustling through the trees. We could see our breath inside the tent, but our sleeping bags were warm, and the excitement of our adventure kept the cold at bay. Olivia was in the middle of telling us about some boy she liked at school when it happened. The sound. It's hard to describe even now. It started faint, like something large moving through the underbrush at the top of the hill. But there was a pattern to it, rhythmic, deliberate, not random like an animal would make. We all fell silent at once. Jessica clicked off her flashlight, plunging us into darkness except for the moonlight filtering through the tent canvas. "Did you guys hear that?" Laura whispered, her voice tight with fear. We nodded, then realized no one could see us in the dark. "Yes," I breathed. The sound grew louder. It wasn't footsteps exactly, more like something heavy being dragged, followed by a pause, then another drag. Thump, scrape, coming from the direction of our corral at the top of the hill. "Maybe it's just the wind," Olivia said, but her voice trembled. She was supposed to be the brave one. Then we heard the wood, the unmistakable sound of lumber creaking under pressure, followed by a sharp crack that echoed across the property. Then another, and another. "Something's breaking our corral," I whispered. Jessica grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. "What is it?" "A bear." There hadn't been bears in Johnson County for decades, but what else could be strong enough to break solid wood? "Bears hibernate in winter," Laura said, her voice barely audible. The breaking sounds continued, growing more violent. Now we could hear splintering, ripping, like something was systematically destroying our little structure. But it was the other noise that terrified me most, a low, guttural sound that rose between the breaking wood. Not quite a growl, not quite human. It made my skin crawl and the hair on my neck stand up. "Let's get out of here," Olivia suddenly hissed. "Now!" No one needed convincing. We scrambled out of our sleeping bags, not bothering with our shoes or extra clothes. I yanked the tent flap open, and we burst outside into the frigid night air. The moon illuminated everything in sharp detail, the frosted grass, our visible breath, the dark outline of the hill looming above us. And at the top, obscured by trees but clearly moving, was a large shadow. Something big. We ran. God, how we ran. Across the field toward my house, our socked feet numb on the frozen ground, not daring to look back. I could hear Jessica sobbing as she ran beside me. The sounds from the hill continued, wood breaking, that strange rhythmic movement, and once, just once, something that sounded almost like words, but too distorted to understand. We crashed through the back door of my house, startling my parents who were watching TV in the living room. We must have looked insane. 4 girls in pajamas, wild-eyed and gasping, feet soaking wet and muddied. "Something's on the hill," I cried, while the others all tried to explain at once. My dad grabbed his rifle and flashlight, and despite my mum's protests, went outside to check. We huddled in the kitchen, terrified he would encounter whatever was up there. 10 minutes later, he came back. "There's nothing out there," he said, confused by our hysteria. "Probably just raccoons, or maybe a stray dog. Your tent's fine, but it's too cold for you girls to be out there anyway." He didn't go up to the corral. It was too dark, he said, and he'd check in the morning. None of us slept that night. We pushed our sleeping bags together in the living room and whispered theories about what we'd heard. Animals don't systematically destroy things. They don't make those kinds of sounds. Whatever was up there had purpose, intelligence. At first light, before my parents were even awake, we pulled on boots and coats and made our way back up the hill. The morning was still and silent, frost covering everything. As we approached the top, Jessica stopped suddenly. "Oh my God," she whispered. Our corral was gone, not just damaged, completely destroyed. The 2x4s were scattered across a 50-foot radius, some pieces flung so far they'd landed at the edge of the woods. Several boards had been pulled completely free from the trees where they'd been nailed, taking chunks of bark with them. One piece was driven almost vertically into the frozen ground, like a spear. But what frightened us most were the marks. Deep gouges in the wood, not like any tool marks we'd ever seen. Some of the boards were literally torn apart, splintered down the middle, as if something had gripped both ends and ripped. The nails were bent and twisted. "An animal couldn't do this," Olivia said, her voice hollow. We searched for footprints, but the ground was too frozen to show any clear marks. There were just some disturbed areas where the frost was scraped away, revealing dark soil beneath. As we stood there in the morning light, I felt a deep, primal fear sink into me. This was our special place, our safe haven for make-believe and childhood games. Now it felt tainted, claimed by something else, something that didn't want us there. We never told our parents the full truth about what we heard that night. My dad concluded it must have been some local teenagers vandalizing our play area, though he couldn't explain how they'd managed to tear apart solid lumber or why they'd bother targeting a children's fort in the middle of nowhere on a freezing January night. We never played on that hill again, never rebuilt the corral, never had another camp out. Something changed in us that night. A loss of innocence, maybe, or the realization that the world contained things we couldn't explain. The four of us stayed friends for years, bound by our shared experience, though we rarely discussed it. When we did, we'd compare memories, making sure we weren't crazy, that it really happened the way we remembered. Jessica moved away in high school. Laura became convinced it was some kind of cryptid, spending hours researching local folklore. Olivia eventually claimed it must have been a bear, despite the season, because the alternative was too disturbing to accept. As for me, I still live in Johnson County. I drive past my old family farm sometimes, though new people own it now. The hill is still there, of course, though the trees have grown thicker over the decades. I never go up there. I can't bring myself to. That night changed something in me. I realized there are things in this world that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. Things that come out under the winter moon and claim territory as their own. Things that want us to know they're there, but don't want to be seen. Sometimes, on cold January nights when the moon is full, I still hear that sound in my dreams. That rhythmic, deliberate movement, the splintering wood, that almost voice. And I wake up knowing that whatever was on the hill that night is probably still out there somewhere, in the darkness beyond our understanding.